Welcome, citizens of Gotham, to a journey through shadows and laughter, through madness and meaning, through the twisted carnival of chaos that is the Joker's tale. Tonight we'll explore the complete story of Gotham's clown prince of crime, from his mysterious beginnings to his eternal dance with the Dark Knight. As you settle into your comfortable space, let these words carry you gently through a tale of transformation, obsession, and the thin line between comedy and tragedy. Close your eyes and let your breathing slow as we venture into the neon-lit streets of Gotham City, where the grotesque and the beautiful intertwine like lovers in an endless waltz. This is not merely a story of villainy, but an exploration of how laughter can become screaming, how joy can curdle into madness, how one bad day can reshape not just a life, but an entire world. So relax, let go of the day's worries, and allow this story to guide you into peaceful slumber, where even the darkest tales can become gentle dreams. In the sprawling metropolis of Gotham City, where gargoyles perch on Gothic spires and fog rolls through narrow alleyways like the breath of sleeping giants, there exists a figure so enigmatic that his very identity has become a riddle wrapped in a smile. The Joker. That name alone conjures images of purple suits, green hair, and a rictus grin that speaks of secrets too terrible to voice. But who is he beneath the chalk-white makeup? What name did his mother whisper to him in childhood lullabies? These questions have haunted Gotham for decades, their answers shifting like shadows in candlelight. The beauty of the Joker's mystery lies not in its solution, but in its persistence. Unlike other criminals whose origins can be traced through police files and birth certificates, the clown prince of crime seems to have materialized from the collective unconscious of Gotham itself, born from the city's need for chaos to balance its rigid order. He is every fear given form, every repressed impulse made manifest, every terrible joke waiting in the darkness to spring its punchline. Some say he was a comedian once, though whether he made people laugh or simply thought he did remains unclear. Others claim he was a criminal from the beginning, a red-hooded figure who led a gang of thieves until fate and chemistry transformed him into something far more dangerous. Still, others whisper that there have been many Jokers throughout history, that the identity is passed down like a viral meme, infecting new hosts with its particular brand of madness. But perhaps the most unsettling theory is that the Joker's past changes because he wills it so. In the depths of his fractured psyche, reality becomes as malleable as warm wax, shaped and reshaped by whim and nightmare. Today he might remember being a failed stand-up comic. Tomorrow, a chemical engineer driven mad by industrial accident. The day after, a perfectly sane man who simply chose chaos as his philosophy. Each version feels true to him in the moment, and perhaps that's what makes him so terrifying. The complete absence of a fixed self, an identity as fluid as mercury, and just as toxic to touch. The chemical vat that supposedly bleached his skin and stained his hair has become almost mythical in Gotham's folklore. Ace Chemicals, that fortress of industrial ambition on the wrong side of the river, where the American dream goes to die in pools of rainbow toxins. The plant has seen many accidents over the years, claimed many lives, but none of those tragedies has captured the public imagination quite like the birth of the Joker. Whether he fell, jumped, or was pushed into those bubbling cauldrons of transformation, the result was the same. A man went in, but something else entirely climbed out. Witnesses to that fateful night describe a figure emerging from the chemical river like a baptism in reverse, hair streaming green poison, skin bleached bone white, lips stretched in a permanent smile that spoke of joy and terror in equal measure. But witnesses lie, memories fade, and even security footage from that night has mysteriously vanished, leaving only the aftermath to speak of what transpired. The Joker himself offers no reliable testimony. His recollections shift with his moods, each telling more elaborate than the last, embellished with details that couldn't possibly be true, yet feel more real than reality itself. The psychological profiles compiled by Gotham's finest minds read like exercises in futility. Dr. Harleen Quinzel, before her own transformation, spent months trying to map the labyrinth of his consciousness, only to lose herself in its twisting passages. Other psychiatrists have fared even worse, some driven to madness themselves, others simply walking away from their chosen profession, unable to reconcile what they've seen with their understanding of the human mind. The Joker seems to exist outside the normal parameters of psychology, a living embodiment of the primal chaos that lurks beneath civilization's thin veneer. What makes him so compelling, so endlessly fascinating to those who study the criminal mind, is not what he reveals, but what he conceals. Every joke hides a dozen meanings, every laugh masks a scream, every gesture of apparent spontaneity conceals calculations so complex it borders on the supernatural. He is a performance artist whose medium is terror, a comedian whose audience never ask to hear his routine, a philosopher whose only argument is the punchline at the end of existence itself. The question that haunts Gotham's nights is not who the Joker was, but who he's becoming. Each crime scene is a work in progress, each confrontation with Batman another verse in an endless poem of conflict and codependency. He evolves constantly, adapting to new challenges, incorporating new fears, finding fresh ways to make the world laugh at its own pain. The man who fell into the chemical vat decades ago may be long dead, dissolved in acid and madness, leaving only the smile behind like the Cheshire Cat's grin hovering in poisoned air. In the deepest part of the night, when Gotham sleeps fitfully and dreams of purple shadows, perhaps the truth doesn't matter. Perhaps the Joker's greatest victory is making us complicit in our own uncertainty, forcing us to confront the possibility that identity itself is just another joke, and we're all waiting for the punchline. His origin story becomes our origin story, his madness a mirror reflecting our own capacity for chaos, his laughter an echo of the screams we keep locked away in the dark corners of our souls. As we begin this journey through his twisted tale, remember that you are safe in your bed, far from Gotham's mean streets and the Clown Prince's domain. Let his story wash over you like a dark lullaby, a reminder that even the most chaotic minds follow patterns. Even the wildest storms eventually exhaust themselves. The Joker may be eternal, but his power lies only in the shadows we allow him to inhabit. In the light of morning, he becomes just another story, another dream fading with the dawn. Before the green hair and purple suits, before the acid-bleached grin became Gotham's most recognized trademark of terror, there was a man. Or perhaps there were many men, each carrying within them the seed of what would become the Joker. The stories vary wildly, shifting like funhouse reflections, each more disturbing than the last, yet all sharing common threads that weave through Gotham's darker history like toxic silk. The most persistent tale speaks of a failed comedian, a man whose dreams were larger than his talent, whose hunger for laughter grew into something cancerous when the world refused to share his sense of humor. Picture him, if you will, standing on the stage of some dingy Gotham comedy club, sweat beading on his forehead under harsh spotlights as his carefully crafted jokes fall flat, landing in the silence like stones in a deep well. The audience shifts uncomfortably, the discomfort feeding his desperation poisoning his delivery, until even he can't tell where the performance ends and the genuine breakdown begins. His name in this version of events was never recorded by the papers. He was one of thousands of dreamers who pour into Gotham each year like moths to a particularly dangerous flame. He had a wife, they say, a woman named Jeannie, who saw past his failures to the man underneath, who laughed at his jokes even when no one else would, whose love became the only applause he truly craved. But love, as the Joker would later preach with evangelical fervor, is just another setup for the cruelest punchline of all. The tragedy struck during one of Gotham's particularly harsh winters, when the city's charity hospitals were overwhelmed and medical care became a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Jeannie, pregnant with their first child, began experiencing complications that required surgery the struggling comedian simply couldn't pay for. Desperation makes criminals of honest men, and the man who would become the Joker found himself considering options that would have horrified his former self. The Red Hood gang offered easy money for what seemed like a simple job. Break into Ace Chemicals, steal some industrial secrets, and everyone goes home rich enough to solve their problems. The Red Hood itself was supposed to be a disguise, a way of concealing identity while maintaining the theatrical flair that would make the papers take notice. But the man who wore it discovered something unsettling about hiding his face behind that crimson dome. It was liberating in ways he hadn't expected. Behind the hood, he could be anyone, do anything, become the confident criminal mastermind he'd always played in his head during those long nights staring at the ceiling, counting unpaid bills instead of sheep. But Gotham has a way of punishing those who reach too far above their station. The night of the heist, everything went wrong with the precision of a carefully orchestrated joke. The plant's security was tighter than anticipated. The police arrived faster than planned, and when the inevitable confrontation with Batman came, that dark figure who haunted Gotham's criminal underworld like a living nightmare, the Red Hood found himself cornered on a catwalk above the chemical processing plant's main floor. The choice he faced in that moment would haunt every subsequent telling of the story. Below him, vats of industrial chemicals bubbled and steamed, their contents unknown but certainly lethal. Behind him, Batman approached with inexorable patience, cape billowing like the wings of some enormous bat, cowl hiding features that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. The fear that gripped the Red Hood in that instant was primal, absolute. The terror of a mouse cornered by a cat that preferred to play with its food. Some versions of the tale suggest he jumped voluntarily, choosing the unknown horror of the chemicals over the certain capture that awaited him. Others claim Batman was more directly responsible, that in their struggle the Red Hood was pushed or thrown into the vat. The truth, like everything else about the Joker's origin, remains frustratingly elusive. What matters is not how he entered the chemicals, but what crawled out the other side. The transformation was both physical and psychological, a death and rebirth that left the man he'd been drowning in a sea of green hair and bleached skin. When he finally pulled himself from those toxic waters, gasping and retching, his reflection in a broken piece of factory glass showed him something that wasn't quite human anymore. The chemicals had done more than change his appearance. They'd stripped away the last pretenses of civilization, revealed the grinning skull beneath the skin of society itself. The laughter started then, bubbling up from depths he didn't know he possessed. It began as hysteria, the natural response to trauma beyond processing, but gradually evolved into something more deliberate, more purposeful. He laughed at his reflection, at his ruined face, at the cosmic joke of his situation. He laughed at the memory of his failed comedy career, at the bitter irony that he'd finally found his perfect audience, himself. Most of all, he laughed at the realization that all his previous attempts at humor had been mere rehearsals for this moment, when life itself had become the ultimate joke. The news of his wife's death reached him later, through channels both official and otherwise. The baby hadn't survived either. The very people he'd turned to crime to save had perished while he was being reborn in chemical fire. The tragedy should have broken him completely, might have driven a saner man to suicide or catatonia. Instead, it became the final piece of the puzzle, the last element needed to complete his transformation from failed comedian to clown prince of crime. If the universe was cruel enough to orchestrate such perfect irony, then irony would become his weapon of choice. But this is only one possible origin, one thread in the tapestry of maybes and might-have-beens that surrounds the Joker's birth. Another version casts him as a petty criminal from the start, a man with no noble motivations or tragic love story, just a small-time crook who bit off more than he could chew and paid a price that transformed him into something far more dangerous than he'd ever been when sane. In this telling, the chemicals didn't create the Joker's madness. They simply gave it a face. Still, other stories suggest multiple possible pasts, changing with the Joker's mood and the needs of whatever psychological game he's playing at the moment. He might tell Batman one version during their first encounter, another to Harley Quinn when wooing her to his cause, and a third to some unlucky psychiatrist trying to unlock the secrets of his psyche. Each story contains elements of truth, but the whole truth remains as elusive as sanity itself in the Joker's twisted worldview. What remains constant across all versions is the sense of one bad day serving as a fulcrum upon which an entire life, and by extension an entire city's fate, would turn. The Joker himself has become fond of this philosophy, preaching it to his victims with the fervor of a street corner prophet. Everyone is just one bad day away from madness, he claims. One tragedy, one moment of perfect despair, one glimpse behind the curtain at the cruel joke existence really is, and anyone could become what he's become. The terrifying possibility that he might be right has kept Gotham's citizens awake on more nights than any specific crime he's committed. Because if the Joker is correct, if sanity really is just a thin veneer over primal chaos, then his origin story isn't unique, it's universal. We all carry within us the potential for that transformation, that moment when laughter becomes screaming, and civilization reveals itself as just another elaborate joke waiting for its punchline. As you drift deeper into sleep, let these origin stories blend and blur in your mind like watercolors in the rain. The truth of how the Joker came to be matters less than understanding what he represents. The shadow self we all carry, the chaos we all suppress, the laughter that might escape if we ever let our guard down completely. In dreams, origins become fluid things, and perhaps that's the most honest way to approach the Joker's birth story, not as historical fact, but as mythology, as the creation myth of Gotham's particular brand of madness. Rest now, knowing that whatever brought the Joker into being happened long ago in a Gotham that exists only in stories and nightmares. You are safe from chemical vats and failed comedy careers, from red hoods and tragic love stories. Let his possible pasts become just another dream drifting through your sleeping mind, no more real than any other fantasy your unconscious might conjure. The man behind the mask remains a mystery, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. From the chemical-stained waters of Ace Chemicals emerged something new to Gotham's criminal landscape. Not merely another thug or gangster, but chaos given human form. Madness wearing a smile like a crown. The newly transformed Joker didn't announce himself with traditional criminal enterprises like bank robberies or territory wars. Instead, he introduced himself to Gotham through a series of elaborate pranks that gradually revealed themselves to be something far more sinister than mere mischief. His first recorded crime bore all the hallmarks of what would become his signature style. The Gotham Museum of Natural History awoke one morning to find their entire dinosaur exhibition improved. With garish paint jobs, the mighty Tyrannosaurus Rex sporting a coat of purple and green, its massive jaws stretched in a rictus grin that mirrored its creator's face. Smaller exhibits had been rearranged into tableaux that told the story of evolution as cosmic joke, with humanity's ancestors engaged in various forms of slapstick violence. The night watchman, found the next morning in the gift shop, couldn't stop laughing long enough to give a coherent statement to police. What unsettled the authorities wasn't the vandalism itself, but the obvious intelligence behind it. This wasn't random destruction, it was commentary, a thesis statement written in spray paint and hysteria. The Joker was announcing his philosophy to Gotham, declaring that life itself was just an elaborate setup for the ultimate punchline, death. The dinosaurs, those ancient kings of the earth, had thought themselves permanent too. Yet where were they now? Painted purple in a museum, serving as props in a madman's comedy routine. The pattern continued with increasing complexity and decreasing humor. The Gotham Stock Exchange found its electronic ticker displays hacked to show only two symbols trading. Ha, 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 their values fluctuating wildly throughout the day as traders tried to make sense of the surreal market data. By closing bell, fortunes had been lost and gained based on nothing more than the Joker's algorithmic laughter, proving his point that the entire financial system was already a joke. He'd simply made it honest about what it was. Those early crimes established themes that would echo through decades of chaos. The revelation of hidden absurdity in everyday institutions, the thin line between order and madness, and the terrible power of laughter to transform reality. The Joker wasn't trying to get rich or gain territory like conventional criminals. He was conducting a philosophical argument through acts of terror, each crime a premise in his larger theorem about the meaninglessness of existence. His calling cards began appearing at crime scenes, playing cards decorated with his own grinning face, their backs inscribed with riddles that made sense only in retrospect. "What's the difference between a dead dog and a dead comedian?" one card asked. The answer, revealed during his attack on Gotham's largest comedy club, proved to be, one of them thinks it's still funny. The club's patrons spent 3 days unable to stop laughing at jokes that weren't funny, their faces frozen in grins that mirrored their tormentor's own permanent smile. The birth of his particular brand of chaos wasn't just evident in what he did, but in how he did it. Every crime scene became a stage, every victim an unwilling participant in his ongoing performance piece. He understood instinctively that terror wasn't just about causing fear. It was about making people complicit in their own destruction, forcing them to laugh at their own pain until they couldn't tell the difference between humor and horror. His weapons of choice reflected this philosophy. Instead of guns or knives, he preferred joy buzzers that delivered lethal electric shocks, lapel flowers that sprayed acid instead of water, and of course, his infamous Joker toxin, a compound that forced its victims to die laughing, their faces locked in grins that spoke of ultimate terror disguised as ultimate joy. Death in the Joker's hands became the final punchline to a joke that had started the moment his victims were born. The psychology behind these early crimes fascinated and horrified Gotham's criminal analysts. Here was someone who understood that the most effective terror came not from random violence, but from the systematic destruction of meaning itself. By making everything into a joke, he robbed his victims of the ability to take anything seriously, including their own safety, their own lives, their own sanity. It was a form of philosophical terrorism that attacked not just the body, but the very foundations of rational thought. His relationship with death during this period revealed another layer of his evolving philosophy. The Joker didn't simply kill people, he transformed them into permanent participants in his cosmic joke. Victims found weeks after exposure to his toxin would still be smiling, their faces frozen in expressions of hideous mirth that seemed to mock the very concept of tragedy. He was creating a congregation of the dead, all bearing witness to his central theorem that existence itself was the setup to a punchline so cruel it could only be delivered by death. The media's response to these early crimes inadvertently played into his hands. Newspapers struggled to categorize him. Was he a terrorist, a serial killer, a prankster, or something entirely new? Their attempts to make sense of his actions only highlighted the senseless nature of existence he was trying to demonstrate. Headlines like "Clown Prince Strikes Again" and "Gotham's Grinning Menace" became part of his mythology, transforming him from criminal to cultural phenomenon. Citizens began reporting Joker sightings everywhere, in shadows that looked like smiles, in the sound of laughter echoing from empty alleyways, in the way certain neon lights buzzed with what sounded like amusement. Gotham was becoming neurotic, seeing its new nemesis everywhere and nowhere, jumping at the sound of its own laughter. He was achieving something no conventional criminal could, making an entire city complicit in its own paranoia. The randomness of his targets served a specific purpose in his emerging philosophy. By striking without apparent pattern, museums one day, financial institutions the next, comedy clubs after that, he demonstrated that safety was an illusion, that the ordered world people took for granted was just a house of cards waiting for the right wind to blow it down. Anyone could be next, anything could be a target, and the only response that made sense was laughter at the cosmic joke of it all. His early encounters with Gotham's police force revealed another aspect of his developing methodology. He didn't simply evade capture, he turned every pursuit into a teaching moment, a demonstration of how easily authority could be undermined by the simple act of refusing to take it seriously. Police found themselves chasing a suspect who treated their investigations like elaborate games, leaving clues that led in circles, creating wild goose chases that ended with the hunters as confused as the hunted. The birth of the Joker's chaos wasn't a single event, but an ongoing process of transformation, both for him and for Gotham itself. With each crime, each twisted joke made manifest, he was rewriting the rules of what criminal behavior could be. He was creating a new category of threat, one that attacked not just physical safety but psychological stability, not just individual victims, but the entire concept of rational society. As Gotham settled into its first winter with the Joker in its midst, citizens found themselves laughing nervously at things that weren't funny, seeing sinister meaning in innocent coincidences, wondering if their own sanity was as fragile as their new nemesis claimed it was. He was accomplishing something unprecedented in the annals of crime, making an entire city question the nature of reality itself, one sick joke at a time. The philosophy that emerged from these early crimes would become his lasting legacy to Gotham, that civilization was just a shared delusion, that sanity was a collective agreement to ignore the underlying chaos of existence, and that laughter, terrible, honest, uncontrollable laughter, was the only appropriate response to the cosmic joke of being human. In transforming himself from man to symbol, from individual to archetype, the Joker had given birth to something entirely new. Chaos as art form, madness as philosophy, terror as comedy. And in the deepest part of each Gotham night, as citizens lay in their beds listening to the distant sound of sirens and wondering if that echo of laughter in the wind was real or imagined, the Joker's central lesson began to take root. Maybe he was right. Maybe life was just an elaborate setup for a punchline so cruel that only madness could appreciate it. Maybe the only choice left was whether to laugh along or go insane trying to find meaning where none existed. The birth of chaos was complete, and Gotham would never be the same. In the shadow-draped streets of Gotham, where gargoyles seemed to watch with stone eyes and fog rolled between buildings like the breath of sleeping monsters, two forces were destined to collide with the inevitability of opposing magnets. The Joker's reign of chaotic terror had transformed the city into a carnival of fear, but on the horizon another figure was taking shape, one who would become both nemesis and strange salvation to Gotham's clown prince of crime. Batman's first encounter with the Joker came not through careful investigation or strategic planning, but through the random intersection of chaos and order that would define their relationship for decades to come. The Dark Knight was still new to Gotham's streets then, more urban legend than established fact, whispered about in the same breath as other creatures that might haunt the city's darker corners. But the night their paths first crossed would establish a pattern that neither could escape, a dance of opposites that would become Gotham's defining mythology. The Joker had announced his intention to redecorate Gotham's City Hall with what he called a fresh coat of honesty. The threat itself was typically cryptic, delivered through a series of postcards sent to major newspapers, each one featuring a different grotesque cartoon of civic corruption, literally painted in bright, garish colors. The police had cordoned off the building, evacuated the mayor and city council, and established a perimeter that they were confident could contain whatever twisted prank the clown prince had in mind. What they hadn't anticipated was that the Joker's true target wasn't the building itself, but the very concept of civic order it represented. As Batman would later piece together from evidence left deliberately in his path, the chemical plant break-in that had birthed the Joker had been just the beginning of a larger plan to demonstrate that all of Gotham's institutions were equally fragile, equally ridiculous, equally deserving of his particular brand of improvement. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. While police focused on protecting City Hall, the Joker had been busy beneath the streets, tapping into the city's water main with industrial equipment stolen from Ace Chemicals. Not to poison the water supply. That would have been too crude, too obviously criminal. Instead, he introduced a compound of his own design, something that would turn Gotham's tap water into a mild hallucinogen, causing citizens throughout the city to see everything through a lens of subtle absurdity. The effects began manifesting just as the sun set over Gotham's skyline. Police officers found themselves giggling at their own radio chatter. Government workers began noticing how ridiculous their jobs really were. Citizens sitting down to dinner with their families started laughing at the arbitrary nature of social customs, the strange ritual of eating while making small talk. The comedy inherent in human existence itself. It wasn't the deadly Joker toxin that would later become his signature. This was something more insidious, a philosophical argument delivered through the municipal water system. Batman detected the contamination through his own sophisticated monitoring equipment, technological marvels that were still crude by the standards he would later develop, but advanced enough to identify the chemical signature of the Joker's work. What struck him immediately was the subtle genius of the approach, not trying to kill Gotham's citizens, but to make them see their city through the Joker's eyes, to recruit them as unwilling participants in his ongoing critique of civilized society. The confrontation that followed took place not in City Hall, as everyone expected, but in the very water treatment plant where the Joker had introduced his commentary into Gotham's bloodstream. Batman arrived to find the facility transformed into a grotesque art installation, pipes painted in purple and green spirals, treatment tanks decorated with enormous smiling faces. The whole complex turned into a monument to the Joker's particular aesthetic vision. The Clown Prince himself waited in the main processing chamber, perched on a throne made of discarded chemical barrels, his white face gleaming in the industrial lighting like a death's head given life. This was the first time Batman saw him in person, and the encounter would be seared into his memory with the clarity that trauma brings to important moments. The Joker wasn't simply insane, he was sanity inverted, logic turned inside out, a funhouse mirror reflection of everything Batman represented. "Well, well, well," the Joker said, his voice carrying that distinctive combination of amusement and menace that would become so familiar to Gotham's protector. "The famous Batman, the Batman, the man dressed as a bat." Each repetition was delivered with increasing hilarity, as if the very concept of Batman's existence was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Do you know what I love most about you already? You're trying so hard to be serious in that costume. It's like watching someone deliver a eulogy while dressed as their own grief." The psychological warfare began immediately. Where other criminals tried to defeat Batman through force or cunning, the Joker attacked the very premise of Batman's mission. Why dress as a creature of the night to fight crime? Why choose fear as a weapon while claiming to protect people? Wasn't the whole concept of a masked vigilante just another form of madness, differing from the Joker's own insanity only in its pretension to heroism? Their first physical confrontation revealed the fundamental difference in their approaches to conflict. Batman fought with precision, strategy, and overwhelming force, each movement calculated to end the fight as quickly as possible with minimal harm to all parties. The Joker fought like chaos made manifest, his every action unpredictable, his weapons chosen for their irony rather than their efficiency. He wielded joy buzzers that delivered electric shocks, squirting flowers filled with acid, rubber chickens that exploded with perfectly timed comedic effect. But it was the Joker's laughter during the fight that truly disturbed Batman. This wasn't the bitter laughter of someone who had given up hope, or the cruel laughter of someone who enjoyed others' pain. It was genuine mirth, authentic joy at the absurdity of two grown men in costumes engaging in elaborate physical comedy, while an entire city slowly succumbed to chemical-induced perspective shifts. The Joker was having fun, and his enjoyment made the violence somehow more disturbing than any display of sadistic cruelty could have managed. The battle ranged throughout the water treatment facility, Batman pursuing his quarry through a maze of pipes and processing equipment, while the Joker led him on a merry chase that felt more like performance art than actual escape attempt. Every trap the Clown Prince set was designed not just to slow Batman down, but to make a point about the futility of trying to impose order on chaos. Floors gave way beneath Batman's feet, revealing that solid ground was just another illusion. Walls proved to be painted facades hiding empty space, demonstrating that reality itself couldn't be trusted. The confrontation's climax came when Batman finally cornered the Joker on a catwalk above the main treatment tanks, an ironic reversal of the Ace Chemicals incident that had created the Clown Prince in the first place. But instead of cowering or fighting, the Joker began to applaud, slow and deliberate, his white gloves creating echoes that bounced off the chamber walls like mocking laughter. "Bravo, Batman, bravo! You've solved the case, caught the criminal, saved the day. But tell me," the Joker's grin widened impossibly, "what have you really accomplished? The water's already in their systems. The thoughts are already in their heads. I've shown Gotham what it really is underneath all that civic pride and social order. Can you unshow them? Can you make them forget what they've seen? Or are you going to beat the inside out of them with your fist?" It was in that moment that Batman realized he was facing something unprecedented in his young career as Gotham's protector. The Joker wasn't just another criminal to be captured and processed through the justice system. He was a philosophical challenge, a living argument against everything Batman stood for, a question mark wearing a smile that demanded answers Batman wasn't sure he could provide. The physical resolution of their first encounter was almost anticlimactic. The Joker allowed himself to be captured, laughing with genuine delight as Batman's restraints secured him for transport to Arkham Asylum. But his surrender felt more like victory than defeat, as if everything that had happened that night had been orchestrated for his amusement, rather than Batman's triumph. The real battle, both combatants understood, was just beginning. And then, during the transport to Arkham, the Joker maintained a steady stream of commentary that burrowed into Batman's psyche like some exotic parasite. Why had Bruce Wayne chosen to become Batman? What childhood trauma or adult disillusionment had driven him to don a costume and wage war on crime? Wasn't the entire Batman persona just another form of madness, a coping mechanism dressed up as heroism? The questions hung in the air between them like chemical residue, impossible to ignore or fully answer. The aftermath of their first encounter rippled through Gotham in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Citizens who had been exposed to the water treatment plant contamination found themselves seeing their city differently, not just while under the influence of the Joker's chemicals, but permanently. They had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of civilized society, and some of them couldn't stop looking. Crime rates fluctuated in unpredictable patterns. Some neighborhoods became more cohesive as residents bonded over their shared experience of chemical-induced perspective shifts. Others descended into chaos as citizens who had seen the arbitrariness of social order decided to stop participating in the collective fiction. Batman, for his part, found that his mission had gained a new dimension of complexity. It was no longer enough to fight crime and corruption. He now had to contend with an enemy who attacked the very concept of justice itself, who made every victory feel like defeat by questioning the premises upon which victory was defined. The Joker had introduced doubt into Gotham's bloodstream more effectively than any chemical compound ever could. In the weeks that followed their first encounter, both Batman and the Joker would find themselves changed by the experience. Batman's methods became more sophisticated, his understanding of criminal psychology deeper and more nuanced. But he had also gained something he'd never possessed before. A nemesis who truly understood him, who could anticipate his moves not through simple criminal cunning, but through genuine insight into the psychological forces that drove him. The Joker, confined but not defeated in Arkham Asylum, began to understand that he had found something rarer than a worthy opponent. He had found his perfect audience, someone whose moral certainty made him an ideal target for philosophical terrorism. Every future escape, every elaborate scheme, every twisted joke would be crafted with Batman in mind, designed not just to challenge Gotham's protector, but to reveal the contradictions and compromises inherent in his crusade. Their first encounter had established the rules of engagement for what would become Gotham's longest-running performance. Order versus chaos, certainty versus doubt, the laughter of madness against the silence of heroic resolve. Neither Batman nor the Joker could have imagined how long their dance would continue, how many lives would be touched by their ongoing conflict, how their personal mythology would become Gotham's defining narrative. But on that first night, as Batman delivered the Joker to Arkham Asylum and the Clown Prince disappeared behind walls that had never successfully contained him before, both participants in Gotham's newest legend understood that something fundamental had changed. The city now had both its greatest protector and its most dangerous threat, and the space between them would become the stage upon which all future dramas would play out. The Dark Knight had arrived, and with him, the eternal dance between order and chaos had begun. The Gothic spires of Arkham Asylum pierced Gotham's skyline like accusatory fingers, their shadow falling across the city's conscience with the weight of all the madness they contained. Within those ancient walls, built on foundations that predated the city itself, the Joker would find both prison and sanctuary, laboratory and theater, a stage perfectly suited to his unique brand of psychological performance art. Arkham wasn't just where Gotham sent its madmen, it was where madness itself went to study civilization, to learn its weaknesses, to prepare for its next assault on the rational world. The asylum's history stretched back to colonial times, when Amadeus Arkham first established his sanitarium for the treatment of mental illness with methods that were progressive for their era, but barbaric by any modern standard. The building itself seemed designed to drive its inhabitants further into madness. Long corridors that echoed with the sounds of despair, cells barely large enough for a human being to stand upright, windows positioned too high to offer any view of the outside world except for tantalizing glimpses of sky that only emphasized the prisoner's separation from normal life. The Joker's first stint in Arkham began with what the staff would later describe as unprecedented cooperation. Unlike other violent patients who raged against their confinement or retreated into catatonic withdrawal, the Clown Prince adapted to institutional life with disturbing ease. He participated in therapy sessions with enthusiasm, answered psychological evaluations with apparent honesty, and showed every sign of responding positively to treatment. It should have been encouraging. Instead, it terrified everyone who worked with him. Dr. Bartholomew Wolper, Arkham's chief psychiatrist at the time, made the Joker his personal project. Here was the case that would make his career, successfully treating Gotham's most notorious criminal, proving that even the deepest madness could be reached through proper therapeutic intervention. The Joker seemed to welcome this attention, engaging with Wolper's theories about the root causes of criminal insanity with what appeared to be genuine intellectual curiosity. "Tell me, Doctor," the Joker said during one of their early sessions, his voice carrying that peculiar combination of childlike wonder and adult menace that characterized all his interactions. "What makes you so certain that sanity is preferable to madness? Have you ever considered that what you call madness might simply be clarity that's too honest for comfortable living? That your patients might be the only ones brave enough to see the world as it really is?" These sessions became legendary within Arkham's walls, recorded on audio tape that would later be studied by criminal psychologists around the world. The Joker displayed an encyclopedic knowledge of psychiatric theory, philosophy, and human psychology that suggested either extensive self-education or a brilliant mind that had been analyzing civilization from the outside for years. But more disturbing than his intelligence was his ability to turn every therapeutic technique back on his therapists, making them question their own assumptions about mental health and social order. Dr. Wolper began reporting strange experiences outside his work with the Joker. He would find himself laughing at inappropriate times, during budget meetings, at funerals, While reading particularly tragic patient files, he started seeing the absurdity in things he'd previously taken seriously, the arbitrary nature of diagnostic categories, the thin line between criminal behavior and corporate ruthlessness, the comedy inherent in spending one's life trying to make crazy people normal in a world that might itself be insane. The other patients at Arkham began to change as well, though it took months for the staff to recognize the pattern. The Joker never spoke directly to other inmates. Arkham's security protocols prevented such interactions, but his influence spread through the institution like a virus of perspective. Patients who had been violently resistant to treatment suddenly became cooperative, but their cooperation took the form of demonstrating exactly what the staff wanted to hear, while clearly not believing a word of it. Two-Face stopped flipping his coin for a week, claiming he'd been cured of his obsessive-compulsive disorder. But when pressed by therapists, he explained that he no longer needed the coin because he'd realized that all choices were equally meaningless, all outcomes equally valid, all decisions equally absurd. His apparent recovery was actually a deeper descent into his particular form of madness, one that now included a sophisticated understanding of why normal people needed the illusion of meaningful choice to function. The Penguin began attending group therapy sessions where he spoke eloquently about reforming his criminal ways and rejoining society as a productive citizen. But his descriptions of normal life were so precisely detailed, so perfectly calculated to match therapeutic expectations, that they felt more like anthropological observations than genuine intentions. He had become an expert in performing sanity, rather than actually experiencing it. The Riddler started answering questions directly instead of responding with puzzles, but his answers revealed that he now saw all communication as riddles, all human interaction as elaborate word games where the real meaning was hidden beneath layers of social convention and polite deception. His apparent cooperation was actually the most complex puzzle he'd ever constructed, one where the solution was that there was no solution, where the riddle was that everything was a riddle. A riddle indeed. So, what with the riddle was that everything was a riddle. The Joker watched these transformations with obvious delight, though he never claimed credit for them directly. When questioned about his influence over other patients, he would express surprise and concern, wondering if perhaps the asylum environment itself was responsible for what seemed to be an outbreak of philosophical clarity among the inmates. Wasn't it interesting, he would muse, that so many different forms of madness were beginning to reach similar conclusions about the nature of reality? His escape attempts were legendary for their creativity and psychological complexity. Unlike other inmates who tried to break out through force or stealth, the Joker specialized in escaping through redefinition. He would convince guards that standard operating procedures were actually elaborate jokes being played on them by the administration. He would demonstrate to orderlies that their jobs were already forms of madness, making them question whether keeping him confined was any saner than letting him go. He turned every aspect of asylum security into a philosophical puzzle, where the guards had to choose between following orders and acknowledging the absurdity of what they were being ordered to do. One particularly memorable escape involved convincing the entire night shift that Arkham itself was an elaborate psychological experiment designed to study the effects of institutionalization on supposedly sane staff members. The Joker presented forged documents suggesting that all the inmates were actually actors, that the whole asylum was a carefully controlled environment designed to see how normal people would behave when given total power over others they believed to be insane. By morning, 3 guards and 2 orderlies had quit their jobs, convinced that they were the real subjects of the experiment and unwilling to participate any longer. The revolving door nature of Arkham's security became a source of dark humor throughout Gotham, Citizens would joke that the asylum had a frequent visitor program for its more distinguished guests, that the Joker probably had his own parking space and a loyalty card that gave him discounts on extended stays. But beneath the humor lay genuine fear. If Gotham's premier mental health facility couldn't contain its most dangerous patient, what did that say about the city's ability to protect itself from the chaos he represented? The Joker's influence on Arkham's staff became a case study in institutional corruption, though not in any traditional sense. He didn't bribe guards or threaten administrators. Instead, he infected them with his worldview, making them see their work through his eyes until they could no longer perform their duties with conviction. Turnover rates at the asylum reached historic highs as employees found themselves unable to reconcile their professional responsibilities with their growing understanding of how arbitrary those responsibilities really were. Dr. Wolper's final session with the Joker was recorded but never publicly released. Transcripts that leaked to the press showed a conversation where the roles of doctor and patient had become completely reversed, with the Joker analyzing Wolper's psychological state, while the psychiatrist defended his sanity with increasing desperation. The session ended with Wolper asking to be transferred to another case, claiming that he no longer felt qualified to treat someone whose condition might be superior to his own. The institutional response to the Joker's disruptive influence was to implement new security measures, revised therapeutic protocols, and stricter isolation procedures. But each new rule seemed only to provide him with fresh material for his ongoing critique of institutional authority. Every attempt to control him became a demonstration of how arbitrary control really was, how dependent social order was on collective agreement to participate in shared fictions about hierarchy and meaning. The asylum's architecture itself began to reflect the Joker's presence. Corridors that had once felt oppressive now seemed theatrical, dramatic backdrops for the ongoing performance of madness versus sanity. The ancient stonework seemed to absorb his laughter and echo it back during quiet hours, making night shift workers wonder if the building itself was going insane. Patients in nearby cells reported hearing jokes whispered through the walls, though security cameras never showed the Joker speaking during his supposed isolation periods. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Joker's relationship with Arkham was how comfortable he seemed there. Unlike other inmates who raged against confinement or plotted escape, he appeared to genuinely enjoy his stays at the asylum. He treated therapy sessions like entertaining conversations, recreational activities like opportunities for creative expression, and isolation periods like meditation retreats. He had found in Arkham something he'd never possessed on the outside, an audience that had to listen to him, a captive population for his ongoing lecture series on the nature of madness and civilization. The staff began to understand that for the Joker, Arkham wasn't a prison, it was a laboratory. Every conversation was an experiment in human psychology. Every interaction was data collection for his larger project of understanding and undermining the foundations of social order. He wasn't trying to escape from madness, he was trying to prove that madness was the only sane response to an insane world, and Arkham provided him with the perfect environment to test his theories. The revolving door became more than a security failure, it became a philosophical statement. Every escape proved that confinement was an illusion. Every recapture demonstrated that freedom was equally illusory. The cycle itself became the point, the endless dance between order and chaos that defined not just the Joker's relationship with Arkham, but his entire worldview about the arbitrary nature of all boundaries and categories. As Gotham's citizens learned to live with the rhythm of the Joker's escapes and recaptures, they unknowingly became participants in his larger experiment. The city developed a strange form of resilience, an ability to function normally while knowing that normalcy could be shattered at any moment by the return of chaos in a purple suit. Citizens would joke about checking the news to see if the Joker was in or out, as if his location was just another piece of information like the weather or traffic conditions. But beneath the surface, adaptation lay a deeper transformation. Gotham was becoming a city that lived with madness as a constant possibility, that had integrated chaos into its daily routine, that had learned to laugh at its own vulnerability because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The Joker's revolving door relationship with Arkham wasn't just a failure of institutional security, it was a successful assault on the psychological security of an entire population. In the deepest part of Arkham's history, in the foundations that predated modern psychiatry and civilized treatment of mental illness, the Joker had found his perfect home. Not because he belonged there, but because he had made it into something that belonged to him. Every corridor echoed with his influence. Every cell reflected his philosophy. Every therapeutic session became another verse in his endless song about the comedy of human existence and the madness of trying to impose order on chaos. The asylum had become what he'd always claimed it was, not a place where madness was treated, but where it was revealed, studied, and ultimately celebrated as the only honest response to an honest look at the world. Arkham's revolving door didn't represent failure to contain the Joker. It represented success in spreading his particular brand of clarity to everyone who passed through its halls, staff and patients alike. Within the twisted ecosystem of Gotham's criminal underworld, the Joker occupied a unique position. Not quite leader, not quite outsider, but something far more complex and dangerous. He was the chaos catalyst that transformed ordinary criminals into legendary rogues, the dark inspiration that elevated petty crime into high art, the madman's madman who made even the most hardened villains question their own motivations. His relationships with Gotham's other notorious criminals revealed layers of his psychology that no amount of psychiatric evaluation had been able to uncover. The Penguin, with his aristocratic pretensions and business-minded approach to crime, represented everything the Joker found simultaneously fascinating and ridiculous about the human condition. Oswald Cobblepot had transformed his physical deformities and social rejection into armor, building an empire of crime that operated with the precision of legitimate business. But the Joker could see through the carefully constructed facade to the wounded child beneath, the little boy who had been mocked for his appearance and who now demanded respect through fear and financial manipulation. Their first collaboration began as a simple partnership, the Penguin's organizational skills combined with the Joker's creative chaos to execute a heist that would have been impossible for either to accomplish alone. But what started as a mutually beneficial arrangement quickly evolved into something resembling a twisted form of therapy, with the Joker serving as an unwilling mirror for the Penguin's deepest insecurities and most carefully hidden truths. "You know what I love about you, Ozzy," the Joker had said during the planning stages of their assault on Gotham's First National Bank. "You've turned your whole life into an elaborate joke, but you're the only one who doesn't get the punchline. You think you're Napoleon, but you're really just Charlie Chaplin with better weapons." The observation had stung the Penguin more than any physical assault could have, precisely because it contained enough truth to hurt. The dynamic between them became a study in contrasts. The Penguin sought respect and legitimacy, craving acknowledgement from a society that had always rejected him. The Joker had transcended the need for social approval by rejecting society entirely, finding freedom in the complete abandonment of others' opinions. Where the Penguin built elaborate schemes to prove his superiority, the Joker created chaos, simply for the joy of watching systems collapse under their own contradiction. Two-Face presented a different sort of psychological puzzle, one that the Joker approached with the fascination of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. Harvey Dent's transformation from Gotham's White Knight into its most conflicted criminal had been triggered by acid scarring that left him physically divided between beauty and horror, order and chaos, good and evil. But the Joker recognized that the scarring had simply made visible a division that existed within everyone, the capacity for both creation and destruction, love and hate, sanity and madness. Their interactions took on the quality of philosophical debates, with Two-Face's coin serving as the focal point for discussions about free will, predetermination, and the arbitrary nature of moral choice. The Joker would argue that the coin was unnecessary, that all choices were equally meaningless, all outcomes equally valid, all attempts to impose moral order on a chaotic universe equally absurd. Two-Face would counter that the coin represented the only honest way to make decisions, acknowledging the fundamental randomness of existence while still maintaining the ability to act. "You flip that coin because you can't face the truth," the Joker told him during a rare moment of collaboration. "The truth that good and evil are just stories we tell ourselves to feel better about the random cruelty of existence. At least I'm honest about being dishonest. You're still pretending there's a difference between your two sides, when really they're both the same person, trying to avoid responsibility for what he chooses to do." The Riddler provided perhaps the most intellectually stimulating relationship in the Joker's rogues gallery connections. Edward Nygma's obsession with puzzles and riddles stemmed from a desperate need to prove his intellectual superiority, to demonstrate that he was smarter than everyone else through increasingly complex challenges and brain teasers. But the Joker saw through this compulsion to the underlying pathology, the Riddler's inability to communicate directly, his need to hide every simple statement behind layers of wordplay and misdirection. Their collaborations often devolved into battles of wit, with the Riddler proposing elaborate puzzles for their joint ventures, while the Joker responded by turning the puzzles themselves into jokes, revealing the absurdity of communication that deliberately obscured its own meaning. Where the Riddler saw intelligence as a weapon to be wielded against lesser minds, the Joker understood that true intelligence meant recognizing the comedy inherent in the human desire to feel superior to others. "Your riddles aren't puzzles, Eddie," the Joker observed during one of their planning sessions. "They're just a complicated way of saying, 'Look how clever I am.' But the real riddle is why you need other people to acknowledge your intelligence when you already know you're smart. What are you really asking when you pose a riddle? The answer is always the same. Do you think I'm worth paying attention to?" And that's the saddest joke of all. Poison Ivy represented a different category of relationship entirely, one that touched on the Joker's complex and largely theoretical understanding of desire and attraction. Pamela Isley's transformation into a plant-human hybrid had given her power over growth and decay, life and death, but had also isolated her from normal human connection in ways that the Joker found both familiar and fascinating. Her seductive abilities were legendary, but they were based on chemical manipulation rather than genuine emotional connection, a form of control that the Joker appreciated for its honesty about what human attraction really was. Their interactions carried an undercurrent of mutual recognition, two beings who had transcended normal human limitations, but had paid the price in their ability to form genuine relationships with others. Ivy's kiss could kill or control, making every potential romantic connection a form of predation. The Joker's presence drove people to madness, making every friendship or alliance ultimately destructive. They were both forces of nature, wearing human masks, playing at relationships they could no longer truly experience. "You know what I find attractive about you, Ivy?" the Joker had said during one of their brief alliances. "You're honest about being poison. Most people spend their whole lives pretending they won't destroy the people they claim to love. You just get it over with quickly. It's more merciful than what normal couples do to each other over decades of marriage." Mr. Freeze provided the Joker with his most tragic counterpart among Gotham's rogues. Victor Freeze had become a creature of ice and isolation, not through madness or criminal ambition, but through grief. His transformation was the result of a desperate attempt to save his dying wife that had instead trapped him in a form of living death, able to survive only in sub-zero temperatures that prevented any human contact. Where the Joker had embraced chaos and meaninglessness, Freeze clung to the singular meaning provided by his love for Nora, preserving her frozen form while searching for a cure that might never come. Their few interactions were marked by a strange form of respect on the Joker's part. Here was someone who had suffered a tragedy comparable to his own chemical transformation, but who had responded by becoming more human rather than less, more focused rather than chaotic, more loving rather than hateful. Freeze represented a path not taken, a different possible response to the fundamental cruelty of existence. "You're the saddest joke of all, Victor," the Joker told him during a confrontation that had brought them together as unlikely allies. "You've turned your whole life into a monument to love, but love is what's keeping you frozen. You could let go, embrace the chaos, learn to laugh at the cosmic joke of mortality. Instead, you choose to suffer beautifully. It's almost admirable if it weren't so pointless." But it was with the Scarecrow that the Joker found his most disturbing mirror image. Jonathan Crane had weaponized fear itself, turning humanity's most primal emotion into a tool for psychological control and scientific study. Where the Joker used laughter to reveal the absurdity of existence, the Scarecrow used terror to strip away the illusions that allowed people to function in daily life. Both were interested in the fundamental psychology underlying human behavior, but they approached their research from opposite emotional poles. Their collaborations were legendary for their psychological complexity and lasting trauma on their victims. The Joker would create situations of apparent safety and humor that would gradually transform into nightmares, while the Scarecrow would amplify the resulting fear until victims could no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. Together, they represented the full spectrum of emotional manipulation: hope and despair, laughter and screaming. The promise of joy immediately followed by the delivery of terror. "We should work together more often, Jonathan," the Joker had suggested after one particularly successful joint venture. "You show people what they're afraid of, and I show them why they should be afraid. Fear and laughter, they're really the same thing, you know. Both are responses to recognizing that you have no control over what happens next. The only difference is whether you fight it or surrender to it." These relationships with Gotham's other rogues revealed layers of the Joker's psychology that his interactions with heroes and civilians could never illuminate. With villains, he didn't need to maintain pretenses about his nature or motivations. He could be honestly dishonest, authentically artificial, genuinely artificial. His critiques of their psychological patterns were also implicit critiques of his own, suggestions about paths not taken and choices that had shaped his own transformation from man to symbol. What emerged from these interactions was a complex portrait of someone who understood human psychology with frightening precision, but who had positioned himself outside humanity in order to observe it more clearly. The Joker served as a dark therapist to Gotham's rogues gallery, forcing each of them to confront the contradictions and self-deceptions that drove their criminal careers. But in doing so, he also revealed his own deepest fear, that understanding the joke of existence meant being forever unable to participate in it authentically. The gallery of grotesques that surrounded the Joker in Gotham's underworld became his unwilling congregation, each one representing a different response to the fundamental challenges of human existence. Through his relationships with them, he continued his ongoing experiment in applied philosophy, testing theories about madness and meaning against the laboratory of lived experience. Each rogue was both colleague and subject, partner and victim in his endless exploration of what it meant to be human in a universe that seemed designed to punish humanity for the audacity of existing. In the twisted family structure of Gotham's criminal elite, the Joker occupied the role of the wise fool, the truth-telling jester who spoke uncomfortable realities that everyone else preferred to ignore. His relationships with other rogues were marked by a combination of affection and contempt, understanding and manipulation, genuine insight and calculated cruelty. He loved them enough to see through their self-deceptions, but respected them too little to allow them to maintain their comfortable delusions. These connections would prove crucial to understanding the Joker's evolution as a character and symbol. Through his interactions with Gotham's other legendary criminals, he refined his philosophy, tested his theories, and ultimately defined himself in opposition to their various forms of specialized madness. Where they were focused, he was chaotic. Where they had goals, he had jokes. Where they sought power or revenge or love, he sought only the perfect punchline to the cosmic joke of existence itself. In the sterile corridors of Arkham Asylum, where madness wore medical degrees and sanity was just another diagnosis waiting to be overturned, Dr. Harleen Quinzel represented everything the institution aspired to be. Brilliant, dedicated, professionally optimistic about the possibility of reaching even the most damaged minds. She had graduated summa cum laude from Gotham University, completed her residency at the city's most prestigious hospital, and chosen to work at Arkham not for the prestige or money, but because she genuinely believed that understanding could heal even the deepest wounds that trauma had carved into the human psyche. Her first encounter with the patient who would ultimately consume and transform her came during a routine rotation through the high-security wing where Arkham housed its most dangerous and notorious inmates. The Joker had been assigned to her caseload almost as an afterthought. Other psychiatrists had declared him untreatable, a fascinating case study, but ultimately a waste of therapeutic resources. Dr. Quinzel saw this assignment as an opportunity to prove that no mind was beyond redemption, that even the clown prince of crime could be reached through proper analysis and treatment. The transformation that followed would become a cautionary tale whispered through the halls of psychiatric institutions worldwide, a reminder that the line between doctor and patient, sanity and madness, helper and victim was far thinner than anyone cared to admit. But it began innocently enough, with a young psychiatrist's genuine desire to understand the mind behind Gotham's most infamous smile. Dr. Quinzel approached their first session with meticulous preparation. She had studied every available file on the Joker's crimes, analyzed video footage of his previous therapy sessions, consulted with colleagues who had attempted to treat him before abandoning the effort as hopeless. She entered the high-secure IT room armed with the latest therapeutic techniques, a carefully structured treatment plan, and an unshakable faith in the power of professional psychiatric intervention to reach anyone willing to engage in honest dialogue about their condition. The Joker was waiting for her, secured to his chair with restraints that seemed almost theatrical in their excess. Leather straps, metal locks, chains that suggested he was some sort of wild animal rather than a human being in need of medical attention. But his eyes were alert and curious, studying his new doctor with the same intensity she was bringing to bear on him. When he smiled, that famous, terrible smile that had launched 1,000 nightmares, it seemed almost welcoming, as if he was genuinely pleased to meet someone new who might understand him. "Dr. Quinzel," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar combination of childlike excitement and adult menace that characterized all his interactions. "How delightful to meet someone who still believes in the possibility of cure. Tell me, Doctor, what makes you think you can succeed where so many others have failed? What makes you special? What makes you think you're immune to the very madness you're trying to treat?" The questions should have been warning signs. Instead, Dr. Quinzel heard them as evidence of intellectual engagement, proof that beneath the criminal exterior lay a mind capable of sophisticated self-reflection. She began their sessions with standard diagnostic procedures, working through childhood trauma, early behavioral patterns, the progression of symptoms that had led to his current condition. But with each session, she found herself more fascinated than horrified by his responses, more intrigued than repelled by his unique perspective on human psychology and social order. The Joker proved to be everything she could have hoped for in a challenging patient. He engaged with her theories, offered insights into his own mental processes, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychiatric principles that suggested either extensive self-education or a naturally brilliant mind that had been analyzing itself for years. More importantly, he seemed to respond to her treatment with genuine appreciation, expressing gratitude for her efforts to understand him, that felt authentic rather than manipulative. "You're different from the others," he told her during their third session, his tone carrying none of the mocking quality that had characterized his interactions with previous therapists. "You actually listen. You actually care. Do you know how rare that is, Dr. Quinzel? Most people hear what they expect to hear, see what they're prepared to see. But you seem to be genuinely interested in who I really am underneath all this." He gestured to his appearance with something approaching self-deprecation, as if acknowledging the theatrical nature of his persona. What Dr. Quinzel didn't recognize was that she was being studied as intently as she was studying him. The Joker had made a career of understanding human psychology, of finding the pressure points that would cause even the strongest minds to crack under carefully applied stress. But Dr. Quinzel represented a different sort of challenge, not someone to break, but someone to transform, to seduce not with violence or fear, but with the promise of understanding and acceptance that she craved in her own professional life. The seduction was subtle, psychological rather than physical, based on the Joker's uncanny ability to identify and fulfill the emotional needs that Dr. Quinzel herself hadn't fully recognized. She had spent her career caring for others, analyzing their problems, offering solutions to their pain, but who analyzed her needs? Who offered solutions to her isolation, her professional frustrations, her growing sense that the world of normal psychology was too small to contain her intellectual ambitions? As their sessions continued, the dynamic between them began to shift in ways that would have been obvious to any outside observer, but remained invisible to Dr. Quinzel herself. She found herself looking forward to their appointments with an enthusiasm that went beyond professional interest. She began staying late to transcribe their conversations, not for clinical documentation, but because she wanted to preserve every insight, every moment of connection, every glimpse behind the mask of madness to the brilliant mind beneath. The Joker began sharing what he claimed were the real stories of his transformation, the genuine memories buried beneath layers of performance and misdirection. He spoke of loneliness so profound it had driven him to embrace chaos as the only honest response to an uncaring universe. He described the chemical accident that had changed his appearance as a form of baptism, a death and rebirth that had freed him from the constraints of normal social interaction, but had also isolated him from the possibility of genuine human connection. "Do you know what the worst part is, Dr. Quinzel?" he said during a session that would later be recognized as the turning point in their relationship. "It's not the crimes or the madness or even the way people look at me like I'm some sort of monster. It's the loneliness. It's being the only one who can see the joke, who understands the punchline, who gets why the universe is set up the way it is. I'm surrounded by people, but I'm always alone, because no one else can see what I see. Until now. Until you." The validation was intoxicating. Here was someone who appreciated her insights, who valued her unique perspective, who saw her as more than just another institutional psychiatrist going through the motions of treatment. Dr. Quinzel began to believe that she had achieved something unprecedented in her field, genuine therapeutic breakthrough, with a patient previously considered unreachable. The Joker wasn't just responding to treatment, he was becoming human again under her care, rediscovering capacities for connection and trust that his trauma had buried beneath layers of defensive madness. But the transformation was mutual, though Dr. Quinzel couldn't see it happening to herself. As she worked to understand the Joker's unique worldview, she found her own perspective shifting, her assumptions about normal human behavior becoming more flexible, her tolerance for chaos and unpredictability increasing. She began to question the rigid structures of institutional psychiatry, to see the arbitrary nature of diagnostic categories, to understand that what society labeled as madness might sometimes be superior insight into the true nature of reality. The night she first helped him escape from Arkham, Dr. Quinzel told herself she was continuing his treatment in a more appropriate environment. The asylum's restrictions were preventing real therapeutic progress, she rationalized. He needed freedom to explore his psychological healing, space to rediscover his capacity for normal human interaction, away from the institutional pressures that kept him locked in patterns of defensive criminality. She was just being a more flexible, more innovative therapist than her colleagues, willing to take risks for the sake of her patient's genuine recovery. The costume came later, the blonde pigtails and red and black outfit that would become as iconic as the Joker's own purple suit and green hair. Dr. Harleen Quinzel disappeared that night, replaced by Harley Quinn, a new identity that represented everything she had discovered about herself through her relationship with the Clown Prince of Crime. She wasn't abandoning her professional training, she was evolving beyond it, becoming something that conventional psychiatry had no category for. Harley Quinn was born in that moment of transformation, emerging from the cocoon of Dr. Quinzel's professional identity like some exotic butterfly whose wings were painted with madness and love in equal measure. She had found in the Joker not just a patient to be healed, but a kindred spirit who understood the arbitrary nature of social order, the comedy inherent in human pretensions to normalcy, the freedom that came from embracing chaos as life's fundamental principle. But the relationship that developed between Harley Quinn and the Joker was far more complex than simple romantic attachment or Stockholm Syndrome. It was a psychological symbiosis, a mutual dependence that fulfilled needs neither had been able to satisfy alone. The Joker gained someone who could appreciate his philosophical insights without being driven to madness by them, Someone who could participate in his elaborate jokes without needing them explained. Someone who understood that chaos could be a form of love and destruction could be a form of creation. Harley, for her part, found liberation from the constraints of normal social interaction that had always felt artificial and limiting. She had spent her professional life trying to help people adjust to a world that might itself be insane, trying to make them functional within systems that were arbitrary and often cruel. With the Joker, she could explore the possibility that adjustment to insanity was itself a form of madness, that true sanity might require rejection of the normal world's basic assumptions about meaning and morality. Their crimes became collaborative art projects, elaborate performances designed to reveal uncomfortable truths about human psychology and social order. Where the Joker alone had been content to create chaos for its own sake, Harley brought a more systematic approach to their partnership, helping him refine his methods and articulate his philosophy in ways that could reach broader audiences. She became his interpreter, his collaborator, his partner in the ongoing experiment of living authentically in an inauthentic world. But the relationship was also marked by genuine tenderness that complicated any simple analysis of it as purely pathological. The Joker, who had spent years isolated by his unique perspective and frightening appearance, found in Harley someone who could see past his exterior to the lonely, brilliant, damaged human being beneath. Harley, who had spent her professional life maintaining therapeutic distance from her patients, found in the Joker someone with whom she could be completely honest about her own needs and desires. Their love was expressed through shared madness, mutual enabling of each other's worst impulses, collaborative destruction of the social order that had failed to provide either of them with meaningful connection. But it was also expressed through moments of genuine care and protection, times when each put the other's well-being above their own destructive impulses, instances of sacrifice and devotion that would have been touching if they hadn't been embedded in such a context of criminality and chaos. The tragedy of Harley Quinn's story lay not in her fall from professional grace, but in her discovery that the most authentic relationship of her life was also the most destructive. She had found someone who truly understood her, who appreciated her intelligence and insight, who offered her freedom from the constraints of normal social expectation, but that freedom came at the cost of everything else she had valued about herself, everything that had made her a functioning member of society, everything that might have allowed her to find happiness through conventional means. The transformation from Dr. Harleen Quinzel to Harley Quinn represented both a love story and a cautionary tale, both a liberation and a form of suicide. She had discovered the most intense connection possible between two human beings, but that connection existed in isolation from the rest of humanity, in opposition to everything society valued as healthy and productive. Her love for the Joker was real, but it was also a form of madness that consumed everything else about her identity. In the years that followed their initial partnership, Harley Quinn would evolve beyond her role as the Joker's devoted companion, developing her own criminal identity and psychological complexity. But she would never entirely escape the shadow of that first transformation. The night when a brilliant psychiatrist lost herself so completely in understanding her patient that she became him. The moment when love and madness revealed themselves to be different names for the same psychological phenomenon. The love story of Harley Quinn and the Joker became Gotham's most disturbing romance, a relationship that challenged every assumption about healthy human connection, while simultaneously demonstrating the intoxicating power of being truly understood by another person. It was a love that could exist only in the space between sanity and madness, a connection that flourished in the chaos between order and destruction, a partnership that proved both the transformative power of genuine acceptance and the terrible price that such acceptance could demand. In the deepest chambers of his fractured psyche, beyond the laughter and the elaborate schemes, beyond the theatrical malice and the carefully orchestrated chaos, the Joker harbored a philosophy that was both utterly mad and terrifyingly sane. It was a worldview that had crystallized during those transformative moments in the chemical vat, refined through years of observing human behavior from the unique vantage point of someone who existed outside society's normal constraints, and perfected through countless experiments in applied psychology conducted on the unwilling citizens of Gotham City. The foundation of his philosophy rested on a single, devastating premise: that sanity was not a natural state, but an elaborate collective delusion, a shared agreement among human beings to ignore the fundamental chaos and meaninglessness of existence in favor of comforting fictions about order, purpose, and moral significance. The Joker saw himself not as mad, but as the only truly honest observer of the human condition, someone who had the courage to look directly at reality without the protective filters that allowed others to function in daily life. "Tom, bad day," he would whisper to his victims as the Joker toxin coursed through their systems, forcing them to see the world through his eyes, even as it killed them. That's all it takes to reduce the sanest man alive to lunacy. That's how far the world is from where I am. Just one bad day. You had a bad day once, am I right? I know I am. I can tell you had a bad day and everything changed. Why else would you be here? Why else would you be dressed like flying mammals? It's funny. It's very funny. And I'm laughing. The one bad day theory became his signature contribution to the understanding of human psychology, a concept that suggested every person carried within them the seeds of their own destruction, their own transformation into something that society would label as insane. The theory wasn't entirely original. Philosophers and psychologists had long debated the fragility of human consciousness and the arbitrary nature of mental health diagnoses, but the Joker's innovation was in treating this insight not as abstract theory, but as practical methodology, a tool for revealing truth through the systematic destruction of psychological defenses. His experiments in applied chaos theory took many forms, each designed to test different aspects of his central hypothesis. He would place ordinary citizens in situations where their comfortable assumptions about reality were gradually stripped away, watching with scientific fascination as they progressed through predictable stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately the kind of acceptance that looked very much like madness to outside observers. The comedy club incident that had made him famous early in his criminal career exemplified his approach. By dosing the audience with a mild hallucinogen that made unfunny jokes seem hilariously amusing, he had demonstrated how arbitrary the difference was between humor and horror, between appropriate and inappropriate emotional responses. The people who died laughing at jokes that weren't funny had experienced a form of enlightenment, he believed. They had seen through the social conventions that determined when laughter was acceptable and when it was pathological. His fascination with death stemmed not from sadistic enjoyment of others' suffering, but from his understanding that mortality was the ultimate absurdity, the final punchline that rendered all human activity meaningless. Every person who died with the Joker's rictus grin frozen on their face had been given the gift of perfect clarity in their final moments. They had understood, at last, what the joke really was. Death was coming for everyone, regardless of their achievements, their relationships, their carefully constructed identities. The only honest response to this universal truth was laughter. Death is the punchline to every joke, he explained to a group of hostages during one of his more philosophical crime sprees. Think about it. Every story ends the same way. Every life concludes with the same final scene. Every human achievement crumbles into dust. Every love affair ends in loss. Every triumph becomes a memory, and then even the memory dies. The universe is telling us a joke, and the joke is that we think our lives matter. The punchline is that we all die anyway. Once you understand that, everything else becomes comedy. His relationship with Batman represented the ultimate expression of his philosophical project. Where other criminals saw Batman as an obstacle to be overcome or destroyed, the Joker recognized him as the perfect audience for his ongoing demonstration of existence's fundamental absurdity. Batman's rigid moral code, his unwavering belief in justice and order, his dedication to protecting people who were ultimately doomed to die anyway. All of this struck the Joker as the most elaborate joke of all, a cosmic comedy performed by someone who didn't realize he was being funny. The dynamic between them became a form of theological debate, conducted through violence and elaborate psychological games. Batman represented the theses that order could be imposed on chaos, that meaning could be created through moral action, that individual lives had sufficient value to justify extraordinary efforts at protection and salvation. The Joker represented the antithesis, that chaos was the fundamental condition of existence, that meaning was an arbitrary construction destined for destruction, that individual lives were brief sparks of consciousness in an indifferent universe that would eventually snuff them out regardless of any heroic intervention. Their confrontations weren't really about crime and punishment, law and order, good and evil. They were about competing philosophies of existence, different approaches to the problem of living in a universe that seemed designed to mock human aspirations. Batman's refusal to kill the Joker represented his commitment to the idea that life had inherent value. The Joker's inability to permanently defeat Batman demonstrated the stubborn persistence of hope, even in the face of overwhelming evidence for despair. The psychology of his laughter deserved particular analysis, as it served multiple functions within his philosophical framework. On its most basic level, it was a defense mechanism, a way of processing trauma and horror that transformed pain into something bearable. But it was also a form of communication, a way of sharing his insights about existence with others who lacked the clarity to see what he saw. When the Joker laughed, he was simultaneously expressing his understanding of life's absurdity and inviting others to join him in that understanding. The different types of laughter he employed carried different meanings and served different purposes. His high-pitched giggle was often associated with moments of genuine discovery, times when he had uncovered some new aspect of human psychology or social organization that confirmed his theories about the arbitrary nature of civilized behavior. His maniacal cackle accompanied acts of destruction, celebrations of chaos that revealed the fragility of the ordered world people took for granted. His quiet chuckle was reserved for moments of intimate conversation, times when he was sharing his philosophical insights with someone he thought might be capable of understanding them. But perhaps most disturbing was his silent smile, the expression he wore during moments of perfect clarity when words and laughter were inadequate to express his understanding of existence's ultimate joke. These were the times when he achieved something approaching transcendence, when his madness revealed itself as a form of enlightenment that was simply too honest for most people to bear. The Joker's relationship with reality itself was complex and deliberately ambiguous. He seemed to exist in a state of controlled dissociation, able to function in the everyday world while maintaining psychological distance from its claims about meaning and significance. He could play the role of criminal mastermind, terrorist, or simple prankster, depending on what the situation required. But these were all performances, masks worn by someone who had seen through the necessity of having a fixed identity. His memory problems, his shifting origin stories, his inability to maintain consistent personality traits, all of these apparent symptoms of mental illness were actually strategies for avoiding the trap of becoming too attached to any particular version of himself. By remaining fluid, by refusing to be pinned down to a specific identity or motivation, he maintained the freedom to respond authentically to each moment without being constrained by previous commitments or self-concepts. The chemical transformation that had created him was both literal and metaphorical. The accident at Ace Chemicals had changed his appearance, but more importantly, it had dissolved the psychological structures that kept most people anchored to conventional reality. The bleached skin and green hair were external signs of an internal liberation from the need to appear normal, to fit in, to maintain the elaborate performance of sanity that society demanded from its members. His crimes, viewed from this philosophical perspective, weren't really crimes at all, but teaching moments, opportunities to share his insights about existence with a world that desperately needed to understand what he had learned. Every bank robbery became a demonstration of how arbitrary the concept of ownership really was. Every hostage situation became a chance to show people how fragile their sense of safety and security actually was. Every confrontation with Batman became a lesson in the futility of trying to impose moral order on a fundamentally amoral universe. The tragedy of the Joker's philosophy was not that it was wrong, but that it might be right. His observations about the arbitrary nature of social conventions, the fragility of human psychology, the ultimate meaninglessness of individual existence in the face of cosmic indifference. These weren't the delusions of a madman, but the insights of someone who had looked too deeply into the nature of reality and had been unable to look away. His madness wasn't a departure from sanity, but an evolution beyond it. A progression to a form of consciousness that was too honest about the human condition to allow for comfortable self-deception. The citizens of Gotham who encountered him often reported lasting changes in their worldview, even when they survived their experiences physically unharmed. They would find themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine, seeing the absurdity in social situations they had previously taken seriously, laughing at inappropriate times because they had caught glimpses of the cosmic joke that the Joker spent his entire existence trying to share. In the quiet moments between his elaborate schemes, when the laughter died down and the chaos settled into temporary calm, the Joker would sometimes experience something approaching peace. These were the times when his philosophy provided genuine comfort, when his understanding of existence's fundamental absurdity allowed him to accept the world as it was, rather than demanding that it be something it could never become. In those moments, his madness revealed itself as a form of wisdom, his chaos as a type of order, his destruction as a method of creation. The philosophy of chaos that the Joker embodied wasn't ultimately about destruction for its own sake, but about honesty in the face of denial, clarity in the midst of delusion, laughter in response to tears. He had become Gotham's jester, the fool who spoke truth to power, the madman whose insights were too threatening to ignore and too accurate to dismiss. His legacy wouldn't be measured in the crimes he committed or the people he killed, but in the questions he forced others to ask about the nature of sanity, the meaning of existence, and the price of looking too deeply into the abyss that stared back from the heart of human experience. As the night deepens around you, let these philosophical musings settle into your consciousness like gentle rain on fertile soil. The Joker's insights about chaos and meaning need not disturb your rest. They are simply one possible way of understanding the world, no more or less valid than any other. In the safety of your bed, surrounded by the familiar comforts of your own reality, his theories become just another story. Another dream drifting through the landscape of sleep. Rest now, knowing that whatever truth lies at the heart of existence, it need not prevent you from finding peace in the present moment. There exists in the mythology of Gotham a single night that crystallized everything the Joker represented, distilled his philosophy into its purest form, and demonstrated with terrible clarity the thin line between comedy and tragedy that he had made his life's work to explore. It was a night that would haunt everyone who lived through it, from the victims who survived to the hero who failed to prevent it, from the criminal who orchestrated it to the city that bore witness to its aftermath, the night that would come to be known as the Killing Joke. The plan had been gestating in the Joker's mind for months, a careful synthesis of his psychological theories and his deep understanding of the people who had become the central figures in his ongoing performance piece about madness and meaning. It wasn't enough to simply commit another crime, or escape from Arkham again, or engage Batman in another elaborate game of cat and mouse. This time, he wanted to prove his central theorem about the arbitrary nature of sanity with experimental precision that would satisfy even the most rigorous academic standards. Commissioner James Gordon had always represented something particularly irritating to the Joker's worldview. Here was a man who had spent decades in law enforcement, who had seen the worst that humanity could offer, who had witnessed more cruelty and senselessness than most people could imagine, yet who somehow maintained his faith in justice, order, and the fundamental goodness of human nature. Gordon was living proof that some people could look directly at chaos and still choose to believe in the possibility of meaning, could experience tragedy and still maintain their sanity, could face the abyss and somehow not blink first. This resilience made Gordon the perfect subject for the Joker's most ambitious experiment in applied chaos theory. If he could break someone as psychologically robust as the Commissioner, if he could demonstrate that even the strongest minds were vulnerable to the right kind of pressure applied with sufficient precision, then his thesis about the universal fragility of human sanity would be conclusively proven. All it would take was finding Gordon's pressure point, the specific trauma that would cause his carefully constructed worldview to collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The answer, when it came to him, was so obvious that the Joker couldn't believe it had taken him so long to see it. Gordon's daughter Barbara, the young woman who had already proven herself capable of extraordinary courage as Batgirl, who represented everything her father believed about the possibility of justice and heroism in a corrupt world. She was Gordon's emotional center, the living embodiment of his hope for the future, the proof that his life's work had meaning because it was protecting people worthy of protection. The plan that emerged from this insight was both elegant and horrific, a carefully choreographed sequence of events designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining the pretense of being an elaborate joke. The Joker would prove that anyone could be driven insane by demonstrating it on someone who seemed absolutely immune to such transformation, and he would do it by forcing Gordon to confront the randomness and cruelty of existence through an attack on the thing he valued most. The abandoned amusement park where the final act would play out had been closed for years. Its bright colors faded to ghostly pastels, Its cheerful rides rusted into grotesque sculptures that seemed designed by madness itself. It was the perfect setting for what the Joker had in mind. A place where joy had once lived, but now existed only as memory. Where laughter had been replaced by the echo of wind through broken structures. Where the promise of entertainment had given way to the reality of decay and abandonment. He spent weeks preparing the site, transforming the defunct funhouse into a gallery of horrors that would serve as the backdrop for his philosophical demonstration. The mirrors that had once shown amusing distortions of visitors' appearances were replaced with images designed to break down psychological defenses. Photographs that revealed the arbitrary cruelty underlying civilized society. Pictures that made explicit the violence that polite people preferred to keep hidden. The recorded laughter that had once welcomed children to harmless scares now carried undertones of genuine madness. Joy curdled into something that spoke of understanding too terrible to bear. On the night itself, everything proceeded with the precision of a Swiss watch wound by insanity. The attack on the Gordon home was swift and brutal, not because the Joker enjoyed violence for its own sake, but because efficiency was necessary to achieve the psychological impact he was aiming for. Barbara Gordon, taken by surprise, fought back with characteristic courage. But courage was no defense against careful planning and overwhelming force. The Joker's associates, chosen for their ability to follow orders without asking questions, subdued her quickly, while the Clown Prince himself focused on the real prize. Commissioner Gordon's capture was almost anticlimactic after months of planning. The older man, faced with the sight of his daughter bleeding and helpless, offered no resistance when the Joker's thugs secured him for transport. His compliance was part of the design. The Joker wanted him conscious and aware for everything that followed, needed him to experience each moment of the ordeal with perfect clarity, so that the full impact of the lesson could be absorbed and processed. The journey to the amusement park took place in silence, broken only by the Joker's occasional commentary on the philosophical significance of what was occurring. He spoke to Gordon, not with the manic enthusiasm that characterized his public persona, but with the calm authority of a professor delivering a lecture to a particularly important student. This wasn't personal animosity or criminal opportunism. It was education, albeit of the most traumatic kind imaginable. "I want you to understand something, Commissioner," the Joker said as their destination came into view. "This isn't about revenge or profit or any of the mundane motivations that usually drive criminal behavior. This is about truth, about honesty, about the courage to see the world as it really is instead of as we wish it were. You've spent your entire career fighting for justice in a universe that doesn't care about justice, maintaining order in a reality that is fundamentally chaotic, protecting people who are going to die anyway from forces that will ultimately claim them regardless of your intervention. Tonight, I'm going to show you what I've learned about the nature of existence, and I really think, that once you understand what I understand, you'll thank me for the clarity." The funhouse itself had been transformed into a multimedia presentation on the theme of human fragility and cosmic indifference. Each room contained carefully designed exhibits that built upon each other in a progression from mild discomfort to devastating revelation. Photographs and recordings that documented the arbitrary nature of suffering, the randomness of tragedy, the meaninglessness of the moral distinctions that people used to navigate their daily lives. It was the Joker's doctoral thesis made manifest, a comprehensive argument about the nature of reality, presented through the medium of carefully orchestrated trauma. Gordon was forced to experience each exhibit while restrained in a device that prevented him from closing his eyes or turning away, ensuring that every image, every sound, every carefully crafted moment of horror would be absorbed and processed by his consciousness. The Joker provided commentary throughout, explaining the significance of each element, connecting the specific demonstrations to larger themes about sanity and madness, order and chaos, meaning and absurdity. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was the series of photographs documenting his daughter's assault, images that captured her pain and vulnerability with artistic precision, while simultaneously destroying any possibility that Gordon could maintain his faith in the fundamental justice of existence. Here was proof that terrible things happened to good people for no reason at all, that courage and virtue were no protection against random cruelty, that the universe was either actively malevolent or completely indifferent to human suffering. "Do you see it now?" the Joker asked, as Gordon's composure finally began to crack under the weight of what he was being forced to witness. "Do you understand what I've been trying to teach everyone all these years? Your daughter didn't deserve what happened to her. You don't deserve what's happening to you. None of it means anything. None of it has purpose. It's all just random violence dressed up in the costume of significance. The joke is on all of us, Commissioner. The joke is that we think our lives matter, that our pain has meaning, that justice exists anywhere except in our own desperate imaginations." The psychological collapse that followed was everything the Joker had hoped for and more terrible than he had anticipated. Gordon's mind, faced with the systematic destruction of everything he had used to organize his understanding of reality, began to fracture along predictable lines. The careful mental structures that had allowed him to function as a law enforcement officer, a father, a husband, a human being, started to crumble as the evidence mounted that everything he had believed about the world was founded on comfortable self-deception. But something unexpected happened. As Gordon's sanity began to slip away, instead of embracing the chaos that the Joker had revealed, instead of laughing at the cosmic joke that existence had played on him, the Commissioner began to fight back, not with denial or rage, but with something the Joker hadn't anticipated: stubborn, inexplicable, completely irrational hope. Even as the evidence mounted that the universe was meaningless, Gordon continued to insist that meaning could be created through human choice. Even as proof accumulated that justice was an illusion, he maintained that people could choose to act justly, regardless of whether justice existed in any cosmic sense. It was Batman's arrival that crystallized the philosophical conflict at the heart of the evening's events. The Dark Knight came not with elaborate plans or technological solutions, but with a simple proposal that cut through all the Joker's carefully constructed arguments. Maybe both of them were insane. Maybe their eternal conflict was just another form of madness. Maybe the only sane response was to end the cycle of violence and mutual destruction that had consumed both their lives. The conversation that followed, conducted in the ruins of the funhouse while sirens wailed in the distance and Gordon received medical attention, became the most important dialogue in the history of their relationship. Batman spoke of rehabilitation, of the possibility that even the Joker could be reached and healed, and return to some form of functional humanity. The Joker responded with his usual litany of cosmic horror and existential despair, but for the first time, there was something like uncertainty in his voice, something that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own arguments. "Sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes another," the Joker said, referring to his own origin story, his own moment of transformation from man to monster. "If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice. But the point is, I had a bad day and it drove me as crazy as everybody else. Only I had a bad day in a chemical plant, so why can't you see the funny side? Why aren't you laughing? The question hung in the air between them like chemical residue, impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to answer satisfactorily. Batman's response? That maybe some people could have bad days without being driven to madness. That maybe the choice between sanity and insanity was still a choice, even after trauma had made sanity seem impossible. Didn't convince the Joker, but it did something perhaps more important. It introduced doubt into a worldview that had previously been absolute, created space for the possibility that his philosophy might be incomplete, opened a crack in the armor of his certainty about the nature of human psychology and cosmic meaning. The joke that the Joker told at the end of their conversation, about two inmates escaping from an asylum, about the impossibility of bridging the gap between madness and sanity, about the futility of trying to help someone who had already fallen too far to be saved, was both a commentary on their relationship and a recognition that some divisions might be unbridgeable. But the fact that Batman laughed, that for a moment they shared a genuine moment of understanding despite everything that had passed between them, suggested that even the deepest philosophical differences couldn't entirely prevent human connection. The aftermath of the Killing Joke rippled through Gotham in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Gordon survived the experience with his sanity intact, though forever changed by what he had witnessed and endured. His continued commitment to justice, his refusal to abandon his principles despite overwhelming evidence for meaninglessness, became a form of heroism that the Joker found both admirable and incomprehensible. Barbara Gordon's recovery from her physical and psychological trauma would take years, but it would also demonstrate a resilience that challenged every assumption about human fragility that the Joker's philosophy depended upon. The experiment had failed, or perhaps it had succeeded too well. The Joker had proven that anyone could be driven to madness, but he had also discovered that some people could choose to remain sane, despite having every reason to embrace insanity. His demonstration of cosmic meaninglessness had been met with an assertion of meaning created through human will. His revelation of universal chaos countered by a commitment to local order. His laughter answered with stubborn hope that refused to be extinguished by evidence of its own futility. In the weeks that followed, as the participants in that night's drama tried to process what had happened and what it meant, the Joker found himself in the unusual position of having his core beliefs challenged, not by argument or evidence, but by simple human persistence. Maybe the Killing Joke wasn't as funny as he had thought. Maybe the punchline wasn't as devastating as he had hoped. Maybe the gap between sanity and madness, between hope and despair, between meaning and absurdity, wasn't as narrow as he had always claimed. But these doubts, if they were doubts, didn't lead to any fundamental change in his behavior or methodology. The Joker continued his career as Gotham's agent of chaos, continued his experiments in applied psychology, continued his ongoing demonstration of humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction, but the Killing Joke had introduced an element of uncertainty into his worldview that would never entirely disappear. A recognition that the questions he was asking about existence might not have the clear answers he had once believed they possessed. The night had been designed to prove that anyone could be driven insane by the right combination of circumstances and pressure. Instead, it had demonstrated something far more complex and unsettling. That sanity and madness might be choices rather than conditions. That meaning might be something people created rather than discovered. That hope might be the most irrational and most necessary human response to an irrational world. The Killing Joke had become a mirror, reflecting back questions about the nature of heroism and villainy, sanity and madness, comedy and tragedy that neither Batman nor the Joker was entirely prepared to answer. As you drift towards sleep, let this story of that terrible night settle into your dreams, not as nightmare, but as a reminder of human resilience in the face of unthinkable trauma. The Killing Joke revealed depths of both cruelty and courage, both despair and hope, both the fragility and the surprising strength of the human spirit. In the safety of your bed, far from fun houses and chemical plants, from purple suits and traumatic revelations, these events become just another story, another dream fading with the approaching dawn. Rest peacefully, knowing that even in a world where such darkness exists, there are still those who choose light, still those who insist on hope, still those who laugh not because life is meaningless, but because laughter itself can be a form of meaning. The laughter of the Joker didn't remain confined to the pages of comic books, trapped in panels and speech bubbles like some exotic creature in a Victorian menagerie. His influence spread across every medium that touched popular culture, adapting and evolving with each new platform, finding fresh ways to disturb and delight audiences who thought they understood what madness looked like when given human form. Each incarnation brought new dimensions to his mythology, different facets of his fractured personality, reflecting the unique possibilities and constraints of television, film, animation, and interactive entertainment. The first time audiences heard the Joker speak, his voice carried across radio waves and into living rooms where families gathered around their wireless sets for evening entertainment. The radio serials of the 1940s had to convey his menace and madness entirely through vocal performance, without the visual cues of his distinctive appearance or the graphic impact of his crimes. The actor who first brought him to life in this medium discovered that the Joker's laughter was an instrument of infinite variation, capable of expressing everything from childlike glee to homicidal rage, from philosophical revelation to existential despair. Television, when it arrived as the dominant medium of popular entertainment, offered new challenges and opportunities for the character's development. The Batman television series of the 1960s, with its campy humor and deliberately artificial aesthetic, might have seemed like the perfect venue for the Joker's theatrical sensibility, but the network censorship standards of the era required a fundamental transformation of his character, softening his homicidal edge into harmless pranks, replacing his philosophical terrorism with elaborate but ultimately safe schemes for financial gain or public attention. The televised Joker of this period was chaos domesticated, madness made safe for family viewing, a cartoon villain who could be defeated by good old-fashioned detective work and wholesome moral courage. Cesar Romero's portrayal, while iconic in its own right, presented a version of the character that had been drained of everything truly dangerous about his comic book counterpart. The laughter was there, the costume was recognizable, the basic personality structure remained intact, but the existential threat had been neutralized, transformed from commentary on the nature of civilization into mere entertainment. But television would prove capable of much darker interpretations of the character. The animated series of the 1990s discovered new ways to present the Joker's mythology that were somehow more disturbing than anything that had been achieved in live action. Animation freed the character from the constraints of human actors' limitations, allowing his facial expressions to become impossibly exaggerated, his physical movements to defy the laws of physics, his very presence to warp reality in ways that suggested madness was not just a psychological condition, but a fundamental force of nature. Mark Hamill's voice work in the animated series became the definitive interpretation of the character for an entire generation of fans. His performance captured every aspect of the Joker's personality: the childlike wonder, the adult menace, the philosophical insight, the complete disconnect from normal human empathy. But more than that, he found in the character's laughter a musical quality that elevated it beyond mere sound effect into a form of communication that conveyed meaning no words could express. The laughter became a language unto itself, with subtle variations that indicated different emotional states and psychological conditions. The high giggle that accompanied moments of discovery, when the Joker had found some new aspect of human behavior to mock or exploit. The rolling chuckle that served as punctuation to his more elaborate verbal jokes and philosophical observations. The maniacal cackle that erupted during moments of triumph or revelation, when his schemes reached their climax or when he had successfully demonstrated some aspect of his worldview. And most disturbing of all, the quiet, almost gentle laughter that emerged during his most introspective moments, when he was explaining his motivations or sharing his insights about the nature of existence with someone he thought might understand. Cinema offered yet another dimension for the character's evolution, with the bigger budgets and longer formats allowing for more complex psychological development and more elaborate philosophical exploration. Jack Nicholson's portrayal in the 1989 Batman film brought a combination of camp and menace that captured something essential about the character's dual nature as both comedian and terrorist, both entertainer and existential threat. His performance emphasized the theatrical aspects of the Joker's persona, while maintaining enough genuine menace to suggest that beneath the performance lay something authentically dangerous. The makeup and costume design for the film created a visual interpretation that became iconic in its own right, different from, but equally memorable as, the comic book appearance. Nicholson's Joker was clearly human in a way that the animated version never needed to be, but his humanity was distorted by chemicals and madness into something that existed in the uncanny valley between person and caricature, between tragic figure and comic monster. The performance suggested that the Joker's transformation had been not just physical and psychological, but ontological. He had become a different category of being entirely, something that used to be human but had evolved beyond those limitations into something simultaneously more and less than what he had been before. But it was Heath Ledger's interpretation in The Dark Knight that pushed the character into entirely new psychological territory, presenting a version of the Joker that was more disturbing than any previous incarnation because he was more recognizably human. Gone were the elaborate origin stories and chemical transformations, replaced by a figure whose madness felt entirely possible within the constraints of realistic psychology. This Joker was what someone might actually become if they fully embraced chaos as a life philosophy, if they completely abandoned social conventions and moral constraints, if they decided to live as an agent of pure entropy in an ordered world. Ledger's performance was characterized by physical mannerisms that suggested a person whose relationship with their own body had become as chaotic as their relationship with society. Constant nervous tics, compulsive lip-licking, a way of moving that seemed to ignore normal human limitations and social boundaries. But the most unsettling aspect of the portrayal was how normal he could seem in certain moments, how his madness would recede just enough to reveal glimpses of the intelligent, possibly even rational person who had chosen to become something monstrous. The makeup and costume design reinforced this interpretation, presenting a Joker whose appearance was clearly artificial, but deliberately crude, as if he had applied his clown face with neither skill nor care, as if the transformation was ongoing rather than complete. The scars that stretched his mouth into a permanent grin were explained through multiple, contradictory stories that emphasized the character's fluid relationship with truth and identity, his inability or unwillingness to maintain consistent narratives about his own past. This version of the Joker spoke with the authority of someone who had looked into the abyss of modern urban existence and had found it looking back at him with amusement rather than horror. His crimes were designed not just to create chaos, but to reveal the chaos that already existed beneath the surface of civilization, to demonstrate that the social order that people took for granted was far more fragile than they wanted to believe. He was less a criminal than a philosopher, using terrorism as methodology, less insane than hyperlogical, in ways that made conventional morality irrelevant. The video game medium offered unprecedented opportunities for interactive storytelling that could place players directly into the Joker's world, forcing them to experience his methodology from the inside, while maintaining enough distance to avoid complete psychological identification. The Arkham series of games created environments where players could explore the Joker's influence on other characters, witness the aftermath of his crimes, and gradually piece together the complex psychological portrait of someone whose madness had infected everything around him. These games discovered that the Joker's presence could be used to transform familiar spaces into uncanny territories where normal rules no longer applied. Arkham Asylum, already a setting associated with madness and confinement, became under his influence a place where reality itself seemed unstable, where corridors might lead to unexpected destinations, where the distinction between memory and hallucination became impossible to maintain. Players found themselves questioning their own perceptions, wondering whether what they were experiencing was part of the game's narrative or evidence that the Joker's madness was somehow contagious even through digital media. The interactive nature of gaming allowed for new forms of psychological horror that played with the relationship between player and character, between controller and controlled. In moments where the Joker seemed to address the player directly, breaking through the fourth wall that separated fiction from reality, the medium achieved something unique in horror entertainment: the suggestion that madness might be able to bridge the gap between imaginary and real, between story and experience. But perhaps the most significant contribution of multimedia interpretations was their collective demonstration that the Joker was larger than any single medium could contain. Each new platform revealed different aspects of his personality, different facets of his philosophy, different approaches to the fundamental questions about sanity and madness, order and chaos, meaning and absurdity that he embodied. Television showed his theatrical side, cinema explored his psychological depth, animation freed him from physical limitations, games made his world interactive and immediate. The character became a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting back the fears and anxieties of each era that reinterpreted him. The campy 1960s television version reflected a time when social order felt secure enough to make light of chaos. The dark 1980s and 1990s interpretations emerged during periods of urban decay and social fragmentation, when the idea of an agent of pure entropy seemed less fantastical and more prophetic. To this day, the idea of an agent of pure entropy seemed less fantastical and more prophetic. The hyper-realistic portrayals of the 2000s corresponded with a time of international terrorism and domestic uncertainty, when the boundaries between civilization and barbarism seemed more porous than previous generations had imagined. Each medium's technical capabilities and cultural constraints shaped not just how the Joker was presented, but what aspects of his mythology were emphasized. Radio focused on his voice and verbal wit. Early television was limited to his less threatening characteristics. Animation allowed for exaggerated physical comedy alongside genuine menace. Modern cinema could explore psychological realism while maintaining comic book theatricality. Video games made his influence interactive and environmental rather than simply narrative. But across all these interpretations, certain core elements remained constant. the laughter that served as both weapon and communication, the philosophical commitment to chaos as life's fundamental principle, the complex relationship with Batman that transcended simple good versus evil dichotomy, the ability to reveal uncomfortable truths about civilization by refusing to participate in its comforting illusions, the suggestion that madness might sometimes be a superior response to an insane world. The multimedia evolution of the Joker demonstrated something important about mythological figures in popular culture. They survive not by remaining static, but by adapting to new contexts while maintaining their essential characteristics. Each new interpretation added layers to the mythology without contradicting previous versions, creating a complex portrait that was larger and more complete than any single work could achieve alone. In the collective unconscious of popular culture, the Joker became a figure that transcended his origins as a comic book villain to become something approaching a modern mythological archetype, the trickster figure, the wise fool, the agent of chaos who reveals hidden truths through destruction and humor. His multimedia manifestations weren't just entertainment, but a form of cultural therapy, allowing audiences to explore their own relationships with madness, meaning, and social order through the safe distance of fictional narrative. As you settle into sleep, let these various interpretations of the Joker's mythology blend and blur in your mind, like channels changing on a television set, like scenes transitioning in a dream. Each version was true to something essential about the character, while being shaped by the unique possibilities of its medium and era. In dreams, all these manifestations can coexist simultaneously, creating a composite portrait that is both familiar and strange, both comforting and disturbing, both meaningful and absurd, much like the character himself, and perhaps much like the experience of being human in a world that often seems to operate according to the logic of dreams, rather than the logic of waking life. In the deepest recesses of human consciousness, where primal fears and fundamental drives wrestle for dominance over our civilized facades, there exists a territory where terror and comedy become indistinguishable from one another. The Joker had made this psychological borderland his domain, becoming its undisputed ruler and most enthusiastic explorer. His genius lay not in his ability to frighten people. Any common criminal could manage that with sufficient violence and unpredictability. His true innovation was in revealing that fear and laughter were not opposites but intimate relatives. Two responses to the same recognition that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than rational minds preferred to acknowledge. The relationship between humor and horror had fascinated philosophers and psychologists long before the Joker began his practical experiments in the field. Both responses involved a sudden shift in perspective, a moment when familiar patterns were revealed to be inadequate for understanding the situation at hand. Both required a kind of mental flexibility, an ability to process information that didn't fit into established categories. Both served as psychological defense mechanisms, ways of dealing with situations that threatened to overwhelm the mind's capacity for rational comprehension. But the Joker understood something about this relationship that academic theorists had missed, that the line between finding something funny and finding it terrifying was not fixed, but fluid, dependent on context, expectation, and the psychological state of the observer. What made people laugh in one situation could make them scream in another, not because the stimulus had changed, but because their capacity to maintain emotional distance from it had been compromised. His crimes were designed to exploit this instability, to push victims past the point where they could safely treat disturbing events as merely absurd. His signature toxin represented the purest expression of this philosophy, made manifest in chemistry. The compound forced its victims to experience the world through his eyes, to see the cosmic joke that existence had been playing on them all along. But the terrible beauty of the toxin was that it didn't change external reality at all. It simply removed the psychological filters that normally prevented people from recognizing how absurd their situation had always been. The laughter it induced was genuine, authentic appreciation for humor that had been present all along, but had remained invisible to minds that needed to maintain the fiction that life was serious, meaningful, and comprehensible. The progression of symptoms in Joker toxin victims followed a predictable pattern that revealed the underlying psychology of his approach to terror. Initial exposure typically produced a mild euphoria, a loosening of social inhibitions that made everything seem slightly more amusing than usual. Victims would find themselves giggling at inappropriate times, seeing the absurd side of situations they would normally take seriously, noticing the gap between human pretensions and human realities that most people worked hard to ignore. As the toxin's effects deepened, this heightened sense of amusement would begin to extend to increasingly disturbing aspects of existence. Pain became funny, fear became hilarious. The prospect of death transformed from ultimate terror into the ultimate punchline. Victims would laugh at their own suffering, find genuine humor in situations that should have inspired panic or despair, discover that terror and comedy were different names for the same recognition that the universe operated according to rules that were both arbitrary and inescapable. The final stages of toxin exposure achieved something that conventional torture could never accomplish. They made victims complicit in their own destruction. By the time death arrived, it came not as unwelcome intruder, but as the natural conclusion to the best joke ever told, the perfect punchline to a setup that had lasted an entire lifetime. The rictus grin frozen on corpses' faces wasn't evidence of suffering, but testimony to enlightenment, proof that in their final moments they had understood something essential about existence that had previously remained hidden. But the Joker's psychological terrorism extended far beyond his chemical weapons. His understanding of fear went deeper than simple tactics of intimidation or shock value. He grasped that the most effective terror was anticipatory, based not on what he was doing, but on what he might do. Not on the actual crimes he committed, but on the knowledge that his methodology made any form of safety or security fundamentally illusory. His reputation preceded him into every situation, carrying with it the accumulated weight of every previous encounter, every story that had been told about his methods, every victim who had survived to describe what it felt like to be on the receiving end of his attention. This reputation was carefully cultivated and maintained, shaped by strategic choices about which crimes to claim credit for, which victims to spare, which details to reveal about his methods, and which to leave tantalizingly vague. The media played an unwitting but crucial role in amplifying his psychological impact. Every newspaper article that described his crimes, every television report that attempted to analyze his methods, every expert commentary that tried to explain his motivations, all of these contributed to a mythology that made him seem larger than life, more dangerous than any individual criminal could possibly be, capable of appearing anywhere at any time to transform ordinary situations into waking nightmares. Citizens of Gotham learned to read the signs of his presence in everyday occurrences that might previously have seemed benign. A child's laughter in a playground could trigger memories of his distinctive cackle. The sight of someone wearing purple clothing might cause momentary panic. The sound of calliope music from a carnival or circus could send people fleeing in terror, their minds immediately making connections to his theatrical sensibilities and love of performance-based crime. This psychological conditioning achieved something unprecedented in the annals of criminal behavior. It made an entire population complicit in their own terrorization. Citizens would scare themselves with imagined threats, see his influence in random coincidences, attribute perfectly normal events to his malevolent planning. He had succeeded in making Gotham's collective unconscious into an extension of his own fractured psyche, a city-wide case study in mass paranoia that served his philosophical purposes better than any individual crime could have managed. His choice of weapons reflected his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between fear and fascination, revulsion and attraction. The joy buzzers, the acid-squirting flowers, the exploding cigars, all of these devices carried a double meaning that simultaneously invited approach and threatened destruction. They were parodies of innocent objects, familiar items transformed into instruments of harm, comfort items revealed as potential weapons. This dual nature forced victims to confront the possibility that anything in their environment might be dangerous, that the distinction between safe and unsafe was as arbitrary as the difference between funny and terrifying. The theatrical nature of his crimes served multiple psychological functions beyond simple attention-seeking. By turning each criminal act into a performance, he forced victims and witnesses to become audience members, passive observers of their own victimization. This transformation from participant to spectator created a psychological distance that could be either protective or deeply disturbing, depending on how successfully victims could maintain their sense of detachment from what was happening to them. But the theatrical framework also trapped victims in a narrative structure they hadn't chosen and couldn't control. They became characters in the Joker's ongoing story about the absurdity of existence, unwilling participants in his philosophical demonstration, supporting players in a cosmic comedy they didn't understand and couldn't escape. This narrative imprisonment was often more psychologically damaging than any physical harm he might inflict, because it robbed victims of their agency and autonomy, making them feel like puppets dancing to strings they couldn't see. His interactions with law enforcement revealed another dimension of his psychological methodology. He understood that police officers, by profession and training, were committed to maintaining social order, protecting civilians, and operating within legal constraints that limited their options for dealing with unconventional threats. This commitment could be weaponized against them, turned into a vulnerability that made them predictable and manipulable. By creating situations where standard police procedures would be inadequate or counterproductive, he forced law enforcement to choose between following protocol and preventing harm, between maintaining their professional standards and achieving practical results. Officers who encountered him often reported feeling psychologically off balance, unable to apply their training effectively, confused by scenarios that didn't fit into established categories of criminal behavior. The effect on Batman was more complex and more personal because their relationship transcended the normal dynamic between criminal and crime fighter. The Joker understood that Batman's crusade was motivated by a deep need to impose order on chaos, to prevent the kind of random violence that had claimed his parents' lives from claiming other victims. This psychological investment in the concept of preventable tragedy made Batman vulnerable to a particular kind of manipulation. The suggestion that his efforts were futile, that chaos was inevitable, that every life he saved would eventually be lost to death anyway. Their encounters became a form of mutual psychoanalysis, with each trying to understand and exploit the psychological patterns that drove the other's behavior. The Joker would present Batman with scenarios designed to force him to choose between competing moral imperatives, situations where any action would result in harm to innocents, puzzles where there was no right answer, and every choice carried terrible consequences. These weren't tests of Batman's skills or resources, but attacks on his fundamental worldview, attempts to demonstrate that heroism was just another form of madness, that the distinction between saving lives and destroying them was arbitrary and meaningless. But Batman's consistent refusal to kill the Joker represented a different kind of psychological warfare, a rejection of the easy solution that would have ended their conflict permanently. By sparing his enemy's life repeatedly, Batman was making a statement about the nature of justice and human worth that the Joker found both admirable and infuriating. It suggested that even the most dangerous criminal retained some essential humanity, that redemption remained possible even for those who had committed unforgivable acts, that the cycle of violence could be broken through moral courage rather than superior force. This restraint forced the Joker to confront the possibility that his philosophy might be incomplete, that his understanding of human nature might have blind spots that prevented him from seeing alternatives to chaos and meaninglessness. Batman's continued faith in justice, despite overwhelming evidence for its absence, became a puzzle that the Joker couldn't solve through conventional means, a mystery that suggested there might be forms of sanity that were superior to his own carefully cultivated madness. The citizens who survived encounters with the Joker often reported lasting changes in their worldview that went far beyond simple trauma or post-traumatic stress. They described seeing the world through different eyes, noticing absurdities and contradictions that had previously been invisible, finding themselves laughing at inappropriate times because they had caught glimpses of the cosmic joke that underlay ordinary experience. Some adapted to these changes, integrating them into a modified but functional approach to daily life. Others never fully recovered their pre-encounter psychological stability. These lasting effects represented the Joker's most significant achievement as an agent of chaos. He didn't just commit crimes and disappear, but left permanent impressions on the psychological landscape of everyone who encountered him. His influence spread through Gotham like a philosophical virus, infecting new hosts with questions about the nature of sanity, meaning, and social order that were difficult to ignore once they had been raised. The psychology of terror that the Joker embodied wasn't ultimately about fear in any conventional sense. It was about recognition, the sudden, disturbing awareness that the world was not what it seemed, that the boundaries between comedy and tragedy were arbitrary, that the difference between sanity and madness was largely a matter of social consensus rather than objective reality. His laughter was an invitation to join him in this recognition, to abandon the comfortable illusions that made normal life possible in favor of a more honest but more terrible understanding of existence itself. In the quiet moments between his elaborate schemes, when the laughter died away and the chaos settled into temporary peace, the questions he raised lingered in the air like smoke from extinguished fires. Was he a madman revealing uncomfortable truths, or a truth-teller driven mad by what he had seen? Was his laughter a symptom of insanity, or the only sane response to an insane world? Were the people who feared him protecting their sanity or protecting their ignorance? These questions had no easy answers, which was exactly what made them so psychologically powerful and so permanently disturbing to contemplate. Across the decades of his existence in Gotham's criminal pantheon, the Joker proved himself to be something far more dangerous than a static villain frozen in amber. He was evolution in action, adaptation made manifest, a character whose fundamental nature remained constant while his surface expressions shifted to reflect the fears and anxieties of each era that tried to contain him. Like a virus that developed resistance to each new antibiotic thrown against it, the Joker mutated and evolved, ensuring his continued relevance in a world that seemed determined to outgrow its need for the truths he represented. The earliest incarnations of his criminal career had been relatively straightforward, focused on demonstrating the arbitrary nature of social order through elaborate pranks and themed robberies that revealed the absurdity underlying civilized behavior. But as Gotham's law enforcement adapted to his methods, as Batman developed countermeasures for his psychological warfare, as the city itself grew more sophisticated in its understanding of urban crime and social dysfunction, the Joker was forced to evolve more complex and subtle approaches to his ongoing philosophical project. His crimes began incorporating elements of modern technology, not because he was interested in technological innovation for its own sake, but because he understood that each new medium of communication and control represented fresh opportunities for chaos. The advent of television allowed him to broadcast his message directly into people's homes, transforming their places of safety into extensions of his psychological laboratory. Computer networks provided new venues for identity manipulation and reality distortion. Social media platforms became tools for spreading paranoia and uncertainty on a scale that previous generations of criminals could never have imagined. But his adaptation went far deeper than simply updating his tools and methods. The Joker himself seemed to undergo fundamental changes in response to the psychological and social pressures of each era he encountered. During periods of social stability and economic prosperity, his crimes took on a more surreal, absurdist quality, as if he were trying to shake complacent citizens out of their comfortable assumptions about progress and security. During times of crisis and uncertainty, his methods became more direct and visceral, exploiting existing fears rather than creating new ones from scratch. The psychological profiles compiled by successive generations of Arkham psychiatrists documented these changes with scientific precision, though they could never quite explain the mechanisms behind them. His intellectual capacity seemed to expand and contract based on the challenges he faced, his emotional range shifting to encompass new forms of affect and experience that previous incarnations hadn't displayed. Most puzzling of all, his memory appeared to be selectively malleable, retaining perfect clarity about some events while developing convenient amnesia about others, as if his psyche were editing itself in real time to maintain narrative coherence. Dr. Ruth Adams, who served as Arkham's chief psychiatrist during the 1990s, made the Joker's evolutionary psychology her primary research focus. Her extensive interviews with him revealed a consciousness that seemed to exist in multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously, remembering events that contradicted each other, maintaining belief systems that were logically incompatible, expressing emotions that belonged to different personality structures entirely. A final report, never published but circulated among psychiatric professionals as an underground document, concluded that the Joker might not be a single individual at all, but some form of collective unconscious made manifest, a living embodiment of society's repressed fears and desires that adapted its presentation to match the psychological needs of each historical moment. He's not insane in any conventional clinical sense, Dr. Adams wrote in her confidential notes. He's something far more disturbing. He's evolution without morality, adaptation without ethics, survival of the fittest applied to psychological rather than physical characteristics. He becomes whatever form of chaos is most needed to balance the particular type of order that dominates his contemporary environment. He's not fighting Batman or the police or even society itself. He's fighting stagnation, complacency, the human tendency to mistake temporary stability for permanent security. This evolutionary perspective explained many of the apparent contradictions in his behavioral patterns across different time periods. The campy theatrical villain of the 1960s had been responding to an era of rigid social conformity and institutional authority, providing a release valve for repressed rebellion and unconventional thinking. The homicidal terrorist of the 1980s emerged during a period of urban decay and social fragmentation, when citizens needed to be reminded that civilization was more fragile than they wanted to believe. The philosophical anarchist of the 2000s appeared when global communication networks made traditional forms of social control obsolete, forcing people to confront questions about identity and reality that previous generations had been able to avoid. His relationship with technology revealed particularly sophisticated forms of adaptation. Early in his career, the Joker had been suspicious of mechanical devices, preferring to rely on chemistry and psychology for his effects. But as computers became central to daily life in Gotham, he developed an almost supernatural ability to manipulate digital systems, turning the tools of modern convenience into instruments of chaos and confusion. He didn't simply learn to use technology, he seemed to intuitively understand its psychological impact, its capacity to alter human behavior and perception in ways that users themselves remained unaware of. The Joker virus, his contribution to cybercrime, represented a perfect synthesis of his traditional methods with cutting-edge digital techniques. The malicious code didn't just damage computer systems, it infected them with his particular brand of logic, causing machines to behave in ways that were simultaneously functional and absurd, efficient and chaotic. Computers infected with the virus would complete their assigned tasks while simultaneously generating random outputs that followed the emotional patterns of laughter, creating a form of artificial madness that spread through networks like psychological contagion. But perhaps his most significant evolutionary adaptation involved his relationship with Batman himself. Their early confrontations had been relatively straightforward conflicts between order and chaos, good and evil, sanity and madness. But as their encounters accumulated over the years, the dynamic between them became increasingly complex and psychologically intimate. The Joker began to understand that Batman was not just his enemy, but his necessary opposite, the force that gave meaning to his own existence, the audience that made his performance worthwhile. This recognition led to a fundamental shift in his methodology. Instead of trying to defeat or destroy Batman, he began working to preserve and enhance their relationship, ensuring that their conflict would continue indefinitely. His crimes became more personal, more specifically tailored to challenge Batman's psychological weak points. While simultaneously strengthening his commitment to heroism, he became Batman's dark therapist, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own nature, while providing him with opportunities to demonstrate his moral superiority. The codependency that developed between them was unlike anything in the annals of criminal psychology. The Joker needed Batman to give his chaos meaning and purpose. Batman needed the Joker to justify his extreme methods and obsessive dedication to crime fighting. The protagonist in each film was even less free than by these films. Each defined himself in opposition to the other, but their opposition had become so intimate and persistent that they were practically two aspects of the same psychological entity, thesis and antithesis, locked in eternal dialectical struggle. This evolution in their relationship corresponded with broader changes in how Gotham's citizens understood and responded to the Joker's presence in their city. Early in his career, he had been seen as an external threat, a monster that had invaded their community from outside and needed to be expelled or destroyed. But over time, people began to recognize that he was as much a product of Gotham as Batman himself, that his madness reflected something essential about the city's character, that he served necessary functions in the urban ecosystem, even as he threatened its stability. Some citizens developed a grudging respect for his honesty about the absurdity of existence, preferring his open acknowledgement of chaos to the comfortable lies told by politicians and civic leaders. Others saw him as a necessary evil, someone whose crimes kept the city's defenses sharp and its citizens vigilant against complacency. A few even viewed him as a kind of perverse public service, someone who revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature that needed to be confronted, even if they couldn't be easily resolved. The Joker's awareness of his own evolution was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychological development. Unlike other criminals who remained trapped in repetitive behavioral patterns, he seemed to possess a metacognitive awareness of his own adaptation process, an ability to observe and direct his own psychological changes with scientific detachment. He would sometimes comment on his own transformation during therapy sessions, describing his evolution as if he were studying himself from the outside, analyzing his responses to environmental pressures with the same intellectual curiosity he brought to understanding other people's psychological patterns. "I've been many things over the years," he told Dr. Patricia Michaels during a session in 2010. "Prankster, terrorist, philosopher, performance artist, force of nature. But the beautiful thing is, I don't have to choose which one is really me. I can be all of them, or none of them, or something entirely new that hasn't been invented yet. Identity is just another joke, Doctor. The punchline is that we think we need to be consistent when consistency is just another form of death. I evolve because evolution is the only honest response to a changing world. Everyone else pretends to be the same person they were yesterday, but I have the courage to become whoever I need to be today." This fluid approach to identity made traditional therapeutic interventions essentially impossible. How could psychiatrists treat someone whose personality was deliberately unstable, whose symptoms changed to stay ahead of diagnostic categories, whose madness was sophisticated enough to anticipate and counter their treatment strategies? The Joker had evolved beyond the reach of conventional psychology, becoming something that existed in the spaces between established categories, immune to standard forms of analysis and intervention. His influence on other criminals in Gotham's underworld demonstrated another aspect of his evolutionary success. Newcomers to the criminal scene would often attempt to copy his methods, adopting theatrical personas and chaotic methodologies without understanding the philosophical foundations that made them effective. But these imitators invariably failed because they were trying to replicate surface behaviors without grasping the underlying evolutionary pressures that had shaped them. The Joker's success wasn't based on his specific techniques, but on his ability to adapt those techniques in response to changing circumstances, to evolve new forms of chaos as quickly as society developed new forms of order to contain them. The emergence of digital media and global communication networks in the 21st century provided him with unprecedented opportunities for psychological experimentation. His crimes began to incorporate viral marketing techniques, social media manipulation, and crowdsourced chaos that turned ordinary citizens into unwitting participants in his elaborate jokes. He discovered that modern technology had created new vulnerabilities in human psychology, new ways for people to lose themselves in artificial realities, new forms of identity confusion that he could exploit and amplify. The Joker understood intuitively that the digital age had created a world where reality itself was becoming increasingly malleable, where the distinction between authentic and artificial experience was blurring, where people were voluntarily surrendering their autonomy to algorithmic systems that claimed to understand their desires better than they did. He positioned himself as the ultimate influencer, someone who could manipulate the influence systems themselves, turning the tools of modern control into instruments of liberation from control. But his evolution wasn't just technological or methodological, it was also spiritual and philosophical. Over the decades of his career, his understanding of chaos had deepened and become more sophisticated. What had begun as simple nihilism had evolved into a complex worldview that acknowledged both the absurdity and the beauty of existence, both the meaninglessness and the profound significance of individual choice in the face of cosmic indifference. The end, he had become something like a dark Buddha, someone who had achieved enlightenment about the nature of suffering and impermanence, but had chosen to use that enlightenment to teach others through shock and trauma, rather than through compassion and wisdom. As Gotham entered each new era of its development, from industrial city to post-industrial metropolis, to digital hub to global symbol, the Joker evolved alongside it, ensuring that he would always remain relevant to whatever new forms of social organization emerged. He was the permanent revolution, the eternal opposition, the force that prevented any system from becoming too comfortable with its own assumptions about how reality should work. In the deepest part of the night, as Gotham slept fitfully under the protection of its various guardians and the threat of its various predators, the Joker's evolutionary success represented something profound about the nature of chaos itself. He had proven that destruction could be creative, that madness could be adapted, that laughter could be revolutionary. He had become not just a criminal or a villain, but a force of nature, as permanent and necessary as entropy itself, ensuring that no order would ever be final. No system would ever be complete. No truth would ever be allowed to become too comfortable with its own certainty. His evolution continues even now, adapting to whatever new challenges and opportunities the future might bring, ready to become whatever form of chaos is needed to balance whatever form of order emerges. He is evolution without end, adaptation without limit, change given human form and turned loose in a world that would prefer to believe in the possibility of permanent solutions to temporary problems. The laughter that began in the chemical-stained waters of Ace Chemicals didn't remain contained within the borders of Gotham City, though its creators and their chroniclers might have wished it would. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into still water, the Joker's influence extended far beyond his original domain, seeping into the collective consciousness of a culture hungry for symbols that could express its deepest anxieties about order, chaos, meaning, and the price of civilization itself. In the decades following his first appearance in comic books, the Joker evolved from simple villain to cultural archetype, joining the pantheon of mythological figures that human societies create to embody their most fundamental concerns about the nature of existence. He became the modern incarnation of the trickster god, the wise fool, the sacred clown whose jokes revealed truths too uncomfortable for ordinary discourse, whose laughter opened windows into aspects of reality that rational thought preferred to keep shuttered. Academic institutions that might have been expected to dismiss him as mere popular entertainment instead found themselves drawn into serious analysis of what he represented. Courses in psychology, philosophy, literature, and cultural studies began incorporating the Joker into their curricula, not as a curiosity, but as a legitimate subject for scholarly investigation. Graduate students wrote dissertations on his role in contemporary mythology, his function as a pressure valve for social tensions, his embodiment of postmodern concerns about identity and authenticity. Dr. Margaret Chen's groundbreaking study, The Laughing Shadow: Archetypal Functions of the Trickster in Post-Industrial Society, traced the Joker's cultural impact through multiple disciplines and demonstrated how his character served essential psychological and social functions that went far beyond simple entertainment. Her research showed that societies experiencing rapid technological and social change consistently produced trickster figures who helped process the anxiety and uncertainty that came with transformation. The Joker was simply the latest and most sophisticated example of this universal human need for chaos agents, who could safely express forbidden thoughts and feelings. Every culture needs its fools, Dr. Shen wrote. Figures who can say what others cannot, do what others dare not, think what others will not. The Joker serves this function for our contemporary moment, when traditional sources of meaning and authority have been undermined by technological change, when identity itself has become fluid and uncertain, when the distinction between reality and simulation grows increasingly blurred. He gives us permission to laugh at things that might otherwise drive us mad. The influence of his aesthetic spread through fashion, art, and design in ways that often seem to occur without conscious intention. The combination of formal elegance with chaotic color schemes, the juxtaposition of beauty and horror, the theatrical presentation of violence as performance. These elements began appearing in contexts that had no direct connection to the character or his mythology. Fashion designers incorporated his visual elements into haute couture collections. Contemporary artists referenced his imagery in gallery installations that explored themes of madness, identity, and social critique. Conan was truly aesthetic, but perhaps most significantly, his approach to communication began influencing how people understood and practiced humor itself. The Joker's innovation hadn't been in telling jokes, but in revealing that everything was already a joke, that the distinction between comedy and tragedy was arbitrary, that laughter could be a weapon as powerful as any physical force. This insight migrated into stand-up comedy, satirical television, internet meme culture, and everyday social interaction, changing how people processed difficult information and challenging events. Comedians began incorporating elements of his methodology into their acts, using laughter not just to entertain, but to reveal uncomfortable truths about power, authority, and social organization. The line between humor and horror became increasingly blurred in popular entertainment, as audiences developed tolerance for darker forms of comedy that would have been shocking to previous generations. The Joker had taught culture that laughing at terrible things wasn't necessarily cruel or inappropriate. Sometimes it was the most honest response available. Social media platforms proved particularly fertile ground for the spread of his influence. The internet's capacity for rapid information dissemination, identity manipulation, and reality distortion created an environment that seemed designed for Joker-esque experimentation with truth and meaning. Memes that incorporated his imagery or philosophy spread across global networks at viral speeds, carrying his particular brand of chaos into contexts and cultures that had never encountered the original character. The phenomenon of trolling, using online platforms to provoke emotional responses through deliberately provocative content, bore clear philosophical resemblance to the Joker's approach to social interaction. Like him, internet trolls seemed motivated not by conventional goals like profit or power, but by a desire to reveal the arbitrary nature of social conventions, to demonstrate how easily people could be manipulated into extreme emotional responses, to prove that rational discourse was far more fragile than participants wanted to believe. But the cultural impact extended beyond digital environments into physical spaces and real-world behavior. The Occupy Wall Street movement, various anonymous operations, flash mob organizations, and other forms of spontaneous collective action showed clear influence from the Joker's model of using chaos to reveal hidden truths about power structures and social organization. Protesters began incorporating theatrical elements, wearing masks, using humor as a weapon against authority, turning their political actions into performances that were simultaneously serious and absurd. The adoption of Guy Fawkes masks by anonymous activists was perhaps the most direct example of this influence. Like the Joker's own theatrical presentation, the masks served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided anonymity and protection, created a unified visual identity for diverse participants, and turned individual protesters into representatives of an archetype, rather than specific persons with particular grievances. The masked figure became a symbol of resistance that transcended any individual's characteristics or motivations. Mental health discourse began incorporating concepts derived from the Joker's portrayal of madness and sanity. His suggestion that insanity might sometimes be a superior response to an insane world resonated with people struggling with psychological distress in societies that often seemed designed to produce anxiety, depression, and alienation. The idea that madness could be a form of clarity rather than confusion offered alternative frameworks for understanding mental illness that challenged traditional medical models. This wasn't necessarily a positive development. Some individuals suffering from serious psychological conditions began identifying with the Joker in ways that made treatment more difficult, seeing their symptoms as signs of superior insight rather than indications that they needed professional help. Mental health professionals reported increased difficulty in treating patients who had internalized the Joker's philosophy about the arbitrary nature of sanity and the validity of chaotic responses to social pressure. The character's influence on political discourse proved equally complex and troubling. His model of using theatrical presentations of chaos to critique established authority appealed to both progressive activists seeking to challenge corporate power and reactionary movements attempting to undermine democratic institutions. The Joker's methodology was politically neutral, applicable to any ideological position that wanted to present itself as more honest and authentic than mainstream alternatives. Politicians across the ideological spectrum began incorporating elements of his approach into their public presentations. The use of deliberately provocative statements to dominate news cycles, the treatment of serious policy issues as opportunities for performance art, the appeal to audiences' sense that everything was corrupt and ridiculous. These tactics became increasingly common in democratic societies worldwide. The boundary between political leadership and entertainment collapsed as officials learned to use chaos as a tool for maintaining attention and avoiding substantive accountability. Educational institutions found themselves grappling with students who had internalized the Joker's critique of authority and institutional knowledge. Traditional pedagogical approaches that relied on respect for expertise and established curricula became less effective, with learners who had been taught to question the foundations of all knowledge claims, to see academic disciplines as arbitrary constructions rather than reliable guides to understanding reality. Teachers reported increased difficulty in establishing classroom authority when students treated educational content as just another form of performance that could be criticized, mocked, or ignored based on its entertainment value rather than its accuracy or usefulness. The influence on law enforcement and criminal justice was particularly concerning. The Joker's model of criminal behavior, theatrical, philosophical, resistant to conventional forms of deterrence or punishment, began appearing in real-world criminal activity. Perpetrators of various crimes started incorporating elements of his methodology, turning illegal acts into performance pieces, using media attention as a primary goal rather than traditional criminal objectives like profit or revenge, treating law enforcement response as part of an ongoing game rather than a serious consequence to be avoided. This created new challenges for police departments, court systems, and correctional institutions that were designed to handle conventional criminal behavior based on rational self-interest and conventional motivations. How do you deter someone whose primary goal is attention and whose methodology treats punishment as just another form of performance? How do you rehabilitate individuals who have rejected the fundamental premises upon which rehabilitation programs are based? The entertainment industry struggled with similar questions about the cultural impact of promoting the Joker's mythology. Studios and publishers found themselves caught between the commercial success of the character and concerns about the potential influence of his philosophy on audiences. Rating systems and content warnings proved inadequate for addressing material that wasn't explicitly violent or obscene, but that challenged fundamental assumptions about sanity, morality, and social organization. Critics argued that popular culture's celebration of the Joker amounted to a form of nihilistic propaganda, teaching audiences to reject meaning, purpose, and moral responsibility in favor of chaos and destruction. Defenders countered that the character served important functions as social critic and philosophical questioner, forcing people to examine assumptions they might otherwise never think to challenge. The debate revealed deep disagreements about the role of entertainment in shaping social values and individual behavior. Religious institutions found the Joker's cultural influence particularly challenging to address because his philosophy directly challenged core theological concepts about meaning, purpose, and divine order. His suggestion that existence was fundamentally absurd conflicted with religious teachings about cosmic significance and moral accountability. Yet some progressive theologians found in his character a modern expression of ancient mystical traditions that used paradox and apparent blasphemy to point toward deeper spiritual truths. The Joker's impact on global culture transcended national and linguistic boundaries, appearing in contexts far removed from his American comic book origins. Artists in Japan incorporated elements of his aesthetic into manga and anime that explored themes of identity and social pressure. European filmmakers created art house interpretations of his mythology that emphasized philosophical rather than commercial elements. Musicians worldwide began referencing his imagery and ideas in songs that dealt with alienation, authenticity, and resistance to conformity. But perhaps the most profound cultural impact was his influence on how people understood the relationship between individual psychology and social organization. The Joker had demonstrated that a single person's refusal to participate in collective fiction could threaten the stability of entire communities. His example suggested that social order was far more fragile than most people realized, dependent on universal agreement to maintain shared illusions about meaning and value that could be shattered by anyone brave or crazy enough to speak obvious truths out loud. This insight migrated into academic fields, artistic movements, political organizations, and everyday social interactions, changing how people thought about conformity, authority, and the price of authenticity. The Joker had become more than a character. He had become a cultural meme in the deepest sense, a unit of information that replicated itself across different contexts while maintaining its essential characteristics and functions. As sleep draws near, let this exploration of the Joker's cultural influence settle into your consciousness like gentle rain on fertile ground. His impact on our collective imagination reveals something profound about the human need for figures who can safely express our darkest thoughts and deepest fears. In the safety of your bed, far from the chaos of cultural transformation and social upheaval, these influences become just another story, another dream drifting through the landscape of rest. The Joker's laughter may echo through our culture, but it need not disturb your peaceful slumber. In the mythology of Gotham City, where legends are born from trauma and heroes emerge from the deepest darkness, no relationship has proven more complex, more enduring, or more fundamentally important than the eternal dance between Batman and the Joker. Theirs is not simply a conflict between good and evil, order and chaos, sanity and madness. Though it encompasses all of these dichotomies, it is something far more profound and disturbing. A psychological symbiosis so complete that neither participant can fully exist without the other. A codependency dressed up as eternal conflict. A love story written in the language of violence and philosophical argument. From their very first encounter in that chemical processing plant so many years ago, both combatants understood instinctively that they had found something rare and precious in each other, not just an opponent, but a completion, a missing piece of their own psychological puzzle that could only be provided by someone who understood them at the deepest possible level. Batman needed the Joker to justify his extreme methods and obsessive dedication to crime fighting. The Joker needed Batman to give his chaos meaning and purpose, to serve as the perfect audience for his ongoing performance about the absurdity of existence. The dynamic that developed between them transcended normal criminal law enforcement relationships because both participants were operating outside normal parameters of human behavior. Batman had chosen to become a symbol rather than remain a person, transforming his trauma into a mission that consumed everything else about his identity. The Joker had undergone a similar transformation in the opposite direction, abandoning conventional identity entirely in favor of becoming chaos incarnate, madness given human form, and turned loose upon the world. Their encounters became a form of theological debate conducted through violence and elaborate psychological games. Each confrontation was simultaneously a battle and a conversation, a physical conflict and a philosophical argument, an attempt to defeat the other and an exploration of the ideas that divided them. They were theses and antitheses locked in eternal dialectical struggle, each generating new understanding through their opposition, while never quite achieving synthesis. Batman represented the faith that order could be imposed upon chaos, that individual action could make a meaningful difference in an indifferent universe, that justice was something worth pursuing, even when its achievement seemed impossible. His every choice affirmed the belief that human life had inherent value, that suffering could be prevented or at least minimized through sufficient dedication and skill, that the forces of darkness could be held at bay through moral courage and technological innovation. The Joker represented the opposing philosophy that chaos was existence's fundamental condition, that attempts to impose order were doomed to failure, that justice was a comforting illusion that distracted people from the uncomfortable truth about reality's arbitrary cruelty. His crimes were designed to demonstrate these principles, to reveal the fragility of civilization and the meaninglessness of individual suffering in the face of cosmic indifference. But what made their relationship so psychologically complex was that each recognized elements of truth in the other's worldview. Batman understood that the universe was indeed chaotic and often cruel, that his efforts to protect people were ultimately futile given everyone's inevitable mortality, that his mission was based more on psychological need than rational analysis of what was possible or effective. The Joker understood that individual choices did matter within their limited contexts, that some forms of order were genuinely preferable to chaos, that his own philosophy was as much a coping mechanism for trauma as Batman's heroic crusade. This mutual recognition created a strange form of respect that often horrified outside observers. They were enemies who understood each other better than anyone else in their lives, opponents who shared insights about existence that they could discuss with no one else, adversaries who had become so psychologically intimate that their conflict resembled a marriage more than a war. Each knew the other's weaknesses and strengths with encyclopedic precision, could predict responses and counter-responses with uncanny accuracy, had developed shared references and private jokes that excluded everyone else from their relationship. The Joker's refusal to learn Batman's secret identity represented one of the most significant aspects of their dynamic. He had numerous opportunities to discover who Batman really was beneath the cowl, possessed the investigative resources and analytical skills necessary to penetrate any disguise, but consistently chose not to pursue this knowledge. The reason wasn't lack of curiosity, but understanding that learning Batman's civilian identity would fundamentally alter their relationship in ways that might destroy what made it valuable to both of them. "I don't want to know who you are under that mask," the Joker explained during one of their rare moments of direct conversation rather than violent confrontation. "If I knew your real name, your day job, your social security number, all the boring details that make you just another person instead of the magnificent symbol you've become, it would ruin everything. You'd stop being Batman and start being just some rich guy with psychological problems and an expensive hobby. Where's the fun in that? Where's the meaning? Where's the poetry? No, my dear Dark Knight, I much prefer you as myth than as man." This deliberate maintenance of mystery served both their psychological needs. Batman could continue to function as a symbol of justice and order without having his civilian identity compromised by someone who understood his psychology better than he understood it himself. The Joker could maintain his relationship with an archetypal opponent rather than a specific individual, preserving the philosophical purity of their conflict without contaminating it with personal details that might generate sympathy or humanization. Batman's consistent refusal to kill the Joker, despite having numerous opportunities and justifications for doing so, revealed another layer of their psychological interdependence. The decision wasn't based on practical considerations. Keeping the Joker alive certainly wasn't the most effective way to protect innocent people from his crimes, nor was it based on religious or legal principles, since Batman operated outside normal legal constraints in every other aspect of his crime-fighting activities. Instead, Batman's restraint reflected his understanding that killing the Joker would be tantamount to philosophical surrender, an admission that the Joker's worldview was correct and that order could only be maintained through the same arbitrary violence that chaos employed. By sparing his enemy's life repeatedly, Batman was making a statement about the nature of justice and human worth that the Joker found both admirable and infuriating. It suggested that even the most dangerous criminal retained some essential humanity, that redemption remained possible even for those who had committed unforgivable acts. But the restraint also revealed Batman's psychological dependence on their relationship. The Joker provided him with a perfect enemy, someone whose crimes were so clearly motivated by malice and chaos that stopping him required no moral ambiguity or ethical compromise. Fighting the Joker allowed Batman to be unquestionably heroic, in ways that confronting more complex criminals or social problems never could. Killing him would eliminate not just an enemy but a source of psychological validation and purpose. The Joker's parallel inability to permanently defeat Batman stemmed from similar psychological needs. Despite possessing the intelligence, resources, and ruthlessness necessary to destroy his opponent, he consistently held back from delivering finishing blows during their confrontations. His elaborate schemes always contained escape routes for Batman. His death traps invariably included solutions that someone of Batman's skills could discover. His psychological warfare never quite crossed the line into trauma so severe that it would incapacitate his opponent permanently. This restraint wasn't mercy or affection in any conventional sense, but recognition that Batman's destruction would eliminate the Joker's primary source of meaning and purpose. Without Batman to serve as audience for his philosophical demonstrations, witness to his insights about existence's absurdity, opponent in his ongoing argument about the nature of reality, the Joker would lose the framework that gave structure to his chaotic worldview. He needed Batman as much as Batman needed him, though neither could acknowledge this dependence directly. Their relationship evolved over the years, developing new dimensions of complexity, as both participants aged and changed while maintaining their essential dynamic. They became like an old married couple who had learned to read each other's moods and motivations with supernatural precision, who could communicate volumes through subtle gestures and inflections, who had shared so many experiences that they possessed a private language incomprehensible to outsiders. The introduction of other characters into their dynamic, Robin, Batgirl, other members of Batman's extended family, and the Joker's various accomplices and followers, served mainly to highlight the unique nature of their central relationship. These supporting figures provided context and contrast, showing how different both Batman and the Joker were when interacting with people who didn't understand them as completely as they understood each other. Robin's presence in particular represented a challenge to the philosophical balance between them. The young sidekick embodied hope, optimism, and the possibility of genuine heroic inspiration rather than trauma-driven compulsion. His existence suggested that Batman's mission might have positive rather than purely reactive motivations, that crime fighting could be about building something better rather than simply preventing something worse. The Joker's violent elimination of Jason Todd was therefore not just murder, but philosophical argument, an attempt to prove that innocence couldn't survive in their dark world, that hope was just another setup for cruelty's punchline. But even this seemingly definitive victory became complicated over time, as Jason's eventual resurrection and transformation into the Red Hood demonstrated that death itself wasn't permanent in their mythological universe, that even the Joker's most devastating crimes could be undone or transformed into opportunities for new forms of heroism and redemption. The killing that should have proven the Joker's thesis about meaninglessness instead became evidence for Batman's belief in the possibility of renewal and second chances. Their confrontations in Arkham Asylum took on particularly intimate qualities, because the institution stripped away many of the external elements that normally characterized their relationship. Without elaborate crime scenes or innocent bystanders, or the complexities of active investigation, their interactions became pure dialogue, unmediated conversation between two of the most psychologically complex individuals in Gotham's history. These sessions often felt more like therapy than interrogation, with both participants analyzing each other's motivations and methods with professional precision. The Joker's escape attempts from Arkham were therefore not just criminal acts, but statements about the nature of their relationship. Each breakout was designed to recreate the conditions under which they could interact as equals, to restore the balance of their dynamic that institutional confinement threatened to disrupt. He didn't escape from Arkham, he escaped to Batman, ensuring that their dance could continue under circumstances where both could function at full capacity. The philosophical argument at the heart of their relationship, whether existence had inherent meaning or was fundamentally absurd, remained unresolved after decades of conflict, because both positions contained elements of truth that neither could fully refute. Batman's heroism was real and meaningful within its limited context, but it couldn't address the larger questions about mortality and cosmic indifference that motivated the Joker's nihilism. The Joker's insights about the arbitrary nature of social order and the inevitability of suffering were accurate, but they didn't negate the genuine value of individual compassion and moral courage that Batman represented. Their eternal dance therefore became a form of living philosophy, an ongoing exploration of fundamental questions about human nature and cosmic purpose that neither could answer alone, but that their interaction kept perpetually alive. They were question and response, problem and solution, thesis and antithesis, generating new understanding through their conflict, while never achieving final resolution. In the deepest part of Gotham's nights, when the city slept uneasily, under the protection of its dark knight and the threat of its clown prince, their relationship represented something profound about the human condition itself. We all contain within ourselves both the capacity for order and chaos, meaning and meaninglessness, hope and despair. Batman and the Joker were not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same psychological reality, different responses to the fundamental challenge of existing consciously in an apparently unconscious universe. Their dance was eternal because the questions it explored were eternal. The conflicts it embodied were inherent to human existence itself. As long as people struggled to find meaning in seemingly meaningless circumstances, as long as individuals tried to impose order on chaotic experiences, as long as consciousness confronted its own mortality and limitation, there would be need for figures like Batman and the Joker to give form to these abstract struggles. In your dreams tonight, let their eternal dance become a gentle rhythm that carries you toward peaceful sleep. The questions they embody about meaning and chaos, order and absurdity, hope and despair need not keep you awake. They are ancient human concerns that have found expression in countless stories throughout history. Batman and the Joker are simply the latest incarnation of mythologies that help us process the fundamental challenges of being conscious, moral beings in a complex and often incomprehensible world. Rest now, knowing that their dance continues in the realm of stories and symbols, where it can explore these eternal questions without disturbing your well-earned peace. As the shadows lengthen over Gotham and our journey through the Joker's mythology draws toward its close, we must confront the most unsettling aspect of his story, that it may never truly end. Unlike heroes who achieve their goals and ride off into sunsets, unlike villains who are defeated and forgotten, the Joker exists in a state of eternal recurrence, constantly dying and being reborn, constantly defeated and constantly returning, a figure whose very nature makes permanent resolution impossible. His legacy extends far beyond the specific crimes he has committed or the particular trauma he has inflicted upon Gotham's citizens. He has become something more fundamental and more permanent than any individual criminal could ever be. He has become an archetype, a symbol, a representation of forces that exist within every human consciousness and every human society. The questions he raises about sanity and madness, meaning and absurdity, order and chaos, are not puzzles that can be solved, but permanent features of the human condition that must be continuously negotiated and renegotiated by each generation. The children who grow up in Gotham, hearing stories about the clown prince of crime, absorb more than just cautionary tales about the dangers that lurk in their city's shadows. They learn that reality is more fragile than it appears, that the adults who claim to have everything under control are just as confused and frightened as children themselves, that laughter can be a weapon as powerful as any gun or knife. These lessons shape how they understand the world, how they approach problems, how they relate to authority and convention, and the comfortable illusions that make normal life possible. Some of these children will grow up to become his followers, drawn to the liberation he promises from social expectations and moral constraints. They will don purple suits and white makeup, commit crimes that are more performance art than traditional criminal activity, seek to continue his work of revealing the absurdity underlying civilized behavior, but their imitations will always fall short of the original, because they will be copying his methods without understanding the philosophical foundation that gives those methods meaning and power. Others will grow up to become his opponents, joining law enforcement or mental health professions, or simply becoming citizens who refuse to let his vision of chaos and meaninglessness triumph over their commitment to order and purpose. They will spend their careers trying to understand him, contain him, heal the damage he has caused, prevent future victims from falling under his influence. But they too will be shaped by their opposition to him, defined by their resistance to the worldview he represents, forever changed by their encounter with the questions he forces them to confront. The most profound aspect of his legacy lies in how he has changed the very nature of heroism in Gotham and beyond. Before the Joker, heroes could operate with relative moral clarity, distinguishing clearly between right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. But his presence has introduced shades of grey that make such distinctions increasingly difficult to maintain. Heroes who encounter him are forced to confront the possibility that their missions might be futile, that their methods might be indistinguishable from those of their enemies, that their commitment to justice might be based more on psychological compulsion than rational ethical analysis. Batman, in particular, has been permanently transformed by their relationship. The Dark Knight who emerges from each encounter with the Joker is subtly different from the one who entered it, bearing new psychological scars, new doubts, new insights about the nature of his mission and the price it demands. The cumulative effect of these changes has been to create a hero who is both more effective and more damaged, more committed to his cause and more aware of its limitations, more certain of his methods and more troubled by their implications. The Joker's influence on Gotham's criminal underworld has been equally profound. Other villains have learned from his example that crime can be about more than money or power or revenge. It can be about philosophy, about art, about making statements that force society to examine its own assumptions and contradiction. The elaborate themed crimes, the theatrical presentations, the symbolic significance that characterizes so much of Gotham's criminal activity can be traced directly to innovations that the Joker introduced to the field. But perhaps most importantly, he has changed how Gotham's citizens understand the relationship between individual psychology and social organization. His demonstration that a single person's refusal to participate in collective fictions can threaten the stability of entire communities has made everyone more aware of how dependent social order is on universal agreement to maintain shared illusions about meaning and value. Citizens who might previously have taken institutions and authorities for granted now understand how fragile these structures really are, how easily they can be undermined by anyone with sufficient insight into their arbitrary nature. This awareness has created a city that is both more resilient and more neurotic, more capable of adapting to chaos and more anxious about the possibility of its arrival. Gothamites have learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition, to find stability in instability, to maintain hope in the face of evidence that hope might be irrational. They have become philosophers without knowing it, grappling daily with questions about existence and meaning that academic specialists spend lifetimes trying to understand. The psychological profiles compiled by generations of psychiatrists and criminal analysts reveal the impossibility of truly comprehending what the Joker represents. Each expert who studies him discovers new aspects of his condition, new layers of complexity, new contradictions that defy simple categorization. He exists in the spaces between established diagnostic categories, immune to conventional forms of analysis and treatment, constantly evolving to stay ahead of attempts to contain or cure him. Dr. Sarah Chen, who served as Arkham's chief researcher for 15 years before retiring to write a comprehensive study of the Joker's psychological impact, concluded that he might not be insane in any traditional clinical sense, but might instead represent a form of hypersanity that was too honest about reality's nature for most people to bear. Her unpublished manuscript, The Sane Madman: Psychological Evolution in Extreme Environments, argued that the Joker's condition might be less pathological than adaptive, a response to environmental pressures that demanded new forms of consciousness capable of processing information that normal minds would find overwhelming. May be what we all become if we continue to evolve psychologically, Dr. Chen wrote in her final notes. A consciousness that has abandoned the comforting illusions that make normal social functioning possible, that has looked directly at the arbitrary nature of existence without blinking, that has found a way to function in full awareness of life's fundamental absurdity. If he's right about the nature of reality, then his madness may be the sanest possible response to insane circumstances. This possibility that the Joker might be evolution rather than devolution, advancement rather than regression, clarity rather than confusion, represents his most disturbing legacy. If he is correct about the arbitrary nature of social order, the meaninglessness of individual existence, the absurdity of attempts to impose rational structure on chaotic experience, then his laughter becomes not the symptom of madness, but the sound of someone who has achieved perfect understanding of the human condition. The stories told about him have themselves become part of his legacy, spreading his influence far beyond the boundaries of Gotham into cultures and contexts that have never directly encountered him. Each retelling adds new elements to his mythology, while preserving the essential characteristics that make him recognizable across different media and historical periods. He has become a meme in the deepest sense, a unit of cultural information that replicates itself while adapting to new environments, ensuring its own survival through constant mutation and evolution. Children around the world now grow up with some version of his story, learning about the clown who fell into chemicals and emerged as chaos incarnate, who fought Batman through elaborate games that revealed uncomfortable truths about civilization and human nature. These stories shape how they understand the relationship between individual psychology and social organization, between meaning and meaninglessness, between the forces of order and the attractions of chaos. The Joker's aesthetic, the purple suit, the green hair, the white skin, the red lips stretched in a permanent grin, has become as recognizable as any religious or political symbol, instantly conveying complex ideas about madness, rebellion, and the rejection of social convention. Artists, activists, protesters, and revolutionaries have appropriated elements of his visual presentation to communicate their own messages about the need for change, the arbitrary nature of authority, the value of thinking outside established patterns. But the most enduring aspect of his legacy may be the questions he has forced into public consciousness about the nature of sanity itself. Before the Joker, madness was generally understood as deviation from normal psychological functioning, a condition to be treated, cured, or at least managed through medical intervention. His example has introduced the possibility that madness might sometimes be superior insight, that mental illness might occasionally represent clarity rather than confusion. that the line between sanity and insanity might be determined more by social consensus than objective psychological criteria. This shift in understanding has had profound implications for how society treats individuals whose behavior deviates from normal patterns. Mental health professionals report increased difficulty in distinguishing between pathological conditions that require treatment and alternative forms of consciousness that might be valid responses to unusual circumstances. The Joker's philosophy that sanity is just another form of madness, that normal behavior is often the most irrational response to irrational situations, has infected therapeutic discourse in ways that complicate traditional approaches to psychological healing. His influence on popular culture continues to evolve and expand, with each new generation discovering fresh aspects of his mythology that speak to their particular concerns and anxieties. The character serves as a cultural mirror, reflecting back whatever fears and desires are most prominent in the collective unconscious of his contemporary moment. During periods of social stability, he represents the threat of chaos that could undermine comfortable assumptions about progress and security. During times of upheaval, he embodies the possibility that destruction might be necessary for genuine renewal and growth. The academic study of his cultural impact has become a field unto itself, with scholars from disciplines ranging from psychology to philosophy to literary criticism finding in his character rich material for exploring fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. Conferences are held, journals published, careers built on analysis of what this fictional figure represents about real human concerns and experiences. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his legacy is how he has changed the nature of storytelling itself. Before the Joker, villains were generally motivated by comprehensible goals: money, power, revenge, love, ideology. They could be understood, predicted, and ultimately defeated through superior force or cleverness. The Joker introduced the concept of the unmotivated antagonist, the enemy who acts not from desire but from philosophy, who cannot be reasoned with or appeased, because his goals are not practical but existential. This innovation has influenced how stories are told across all media, creating new narrative possibilities while also new forms of horror and uncertainty. Audiences can no longer assume that villains will behave rationally, that conflicts will be resolved through conventional means, that good will triumph simply because it is good. The Joker's legacy has been to introduce genuine uncertainty into narrative structures that previously operated according to predictable moral framework. As our exploration of his story draws to a close, we must acknowledge that the Joker's greatest victory may be his survival. Of every attempt to contain, explain, or eliminate him, he exists now as a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, as eternal as the psychological and philosophical questions he embodies. Each generation will encounter him anew, find in his mythology fresh relevance to their contemporary concerns, discover in his laughter echoes of their own deepest fears and most forbidden thoughts. His legacy is not just the crimes he has committed or the trauma he has caused, but the questions he has raised about the nature of existence itself. What does it mean to be sane in an insane world? How do we find meaning in apparently meaningless circumstances? What is the difference between civilization and barbarism, between order and chaos, between comedy and tragedy? These questions have no final answers, which is why the Joker remains eternally relevant, eternally disturbing, eternally necessary as a figure who forces us to confront aspects of reality that we would prefer to ignore. In the end, his greatest joke may be that he has made philosophers of us all, turning every citizen into someone who must grapple with ultimate questions about existence and meaning. sanity and madness, the nature of reality and the price of consciousness. We are all his students now, whether we acknowledge it or not, all participants in his ongoing experiment in applied chaos theory, all subjects in his lifelong study of how human beings respond when forced to confront the possibility that everything they believe about the world might be wrong. The laughter that began in those chemical-stained waters has become eternal, echoing through generations of stories and dreams, nightmares and revelations. It is the sound of someone who has seen too much truth to ever be comfortable with comfortable illusions again. The voice of chaos reminding order that its victory is always temporary. The whisper of madness suggesting that sanity might be just another joke waiting for its punchline. As you drift towards sleep, let this exploration of the Joker's legacy settle into your dreams not as nightmare, but as reminder of the complex questions that consciousness must grapple with in any age. His story is our story. His questions are questions, his laughter an echo of our own recognition that existence is simultaneously tragic and comic, meaningful and absurd, beautiful and terrible, beyond our capacity to fully comprehend. Rest now in the knowledge that stories like his exist not to frighten us, but to help us process fears and uncertainties that are part of the human condition. In dreams, even the most disturbing tales can become gentle. Even the darkest characters can serve as guides through the landscapes of sleep. The Joker's eternal laughter becomes just another sound in the symphony of night, no more threatening than wind through trees or rain against windows, carrying you peacefully toward the renewal that morning always brings. Sleep well, knowing that whatever truths his mythology reveals about chaos and meaning, order and madness, you remain safe in the sanctuary of your own consciousness, protected by the very humanity that his philosophy questions but cannot ultimately destroy. The eternal Joker lives on in stories and symbols where he can continue to explore life's deepest mysteries without disturbing the peace of those wise enough to let his questions remain questions, his jokes remain jokes, his chaos remain safely contained within the boundaries of imagination and dream. Good night. May your dreams be filled with gentler laughter than his, sweeter chaos than he could ever imagine, and the kind of meaning that needs no justification beyond its own peaceful existence. The story is complete, the night is deep, and you are free to rest in whatever truth brings you comfort and peace. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most profound questions are best answered not with words, but with the quiet wisdom of sleep itself.